Okay, we're ready.
Welcome to this conference, International Perspectives on the Future of Architecture and Urbanism in the Post-COVID Age, the fourth international symposium organized by the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative. I'm Mohammad Garipur.
And I'm Caitlin D. Clark.
We are pleased to be joined by panelists and presenters from 21 countries and participants representing 89 countries, which became 90 this morning. Indeed, this is an evidence of the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the simultaneous crisis of institutionalized racism, economic and racial inequality, and climate change have left few corners of the globe untouched. Only a few days ago, we reached a devastating global milestone of 2 million deaths worldwide due to COVID-19. Yet the opportunity for us to convene together today and to work toward a healthier and more just world post-COVID-19 is indeed an occasion for hope. As discussed in our previous conferences, long before the appearance of COVID-19, the urban fabric of cities across the world had been shaped by previous epidemics. Indeed, the study of historic global epidemics has illuminated the many ways in which urban life and architecture have changed during times of pestilence. Undoubtedly, the cities, workplaces, schools, homes, and spaces of recreation we inhabit today will undergo large and small changes in the wake of COVID, and as we anticipate the inevitable next epidemic or pandemic. What might these changes look like? Or more to the point, what should they look like? In other words, how might we use this time of rebuilding, of rethinking to envision, design, and inhabit cities that are more just and equitable? How might we reduce our collective carbon footprints and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How might we bring more voices into the process of design? How might we recenter health in all design practices and processes?
Over the next 2 days, scholars and practitioners from 21 countries will confront these questions and present case studies of the impacts of this pandemic on a range of spatial contexts and practices, and in so doing, help us imagine new possibilities for a post-COVID urban landscape. Topics include today, response and experience, ecology and sustainability, and education and pedagogy. Tomorrow's topics include design and interventions, healthcare design, and social justice and equity. Today's session is being live streamed to the Epidemic Urbanism YouTube channel, and recordings of all sessions will be publicly available on our YouTube channel as well. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get updates as this content becomes available. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the contributions of our speakers who worked hard during the holidays, as well as those of our wonderful panel chairs, and we also want to thank all participants who are joining us from across the world. We would also like to thank the AIA Design and Health Research Consortium for their support for this virtual conference. Each of the 3 sessions presented today will last 1 hour. In each session, after a brief introduction, you will hear 4 to 5 papers, and the session moderator will then respond with their comments and then open the session for Q&A. We invite you to ask any questions you have in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, here in Zoom, or for those of you watching on YouTube, you can type questions into the live chat space. Please note that we may not be able to answer all questions, but do know that all questions will be saved and shared with presenters to guide future work. We appreciate your questions and comments. So now let's begin.
Our first session is titled Response and Experience. COVID-19 has profoundly shifted our experience of public and domestic spaces alike, and as have the range of interventions, policies, and social practices that have emerged to enforce social distancing in communities across the globe. Papers in this session will address how urban and rural communities are experiencing and responding to COVID-19 in daily life, at work, at school, and in urban spaces. How governments have envisioned or imposed interventions and the often uneven impact of these interventions on urban communities, the ways in which communities are responding to or resisting such interventions, how the epidemic has shifted social practices and experiences in public and domestic spaces, and the future of a range of institutions and practices in a post-COVID world. What these case studies remind us of collectively is the need for social connection and of tending to the social and physical aspects of experience, and even especially in a socially distanced context. The moderator for this session is my friend and colleague, Dr. Eliana Abu Hamdi. Dr. Abu Hamdi is program manager for the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative at MIT, as well as an adjunct assistant professor at Hunter College. She is an architectural historian, urbanist designer, and global South scholar with published articles and contributed chapters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mohammed and Caitlin, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and be part of this wonderful project. I'll begin by introducing our first speakers for the first paper. Nicole Lalouvier is a doctoral fellow at the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies within the Department of Architecture, ETH Zurich. Her doctoral research project is an investigation into the landscape and material history of the irrigation systems of the Canton Valais in Switzerland. Her co-presenter is Renal Sargent. She's an urbanist, planner, and design and community advocate based in Trinidad and Tobago. She's a former Chevening Scholar who earned a Master of Research in Interdisciplinary Urban Design from the University College of London in the UK. Her work lies at the intersection of urban studies, public sector reform, and technology, with a focus on public space and design.
This paper proposes to examine the social practice of liming as a form of commoning in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in Trinidad and Tobago. This Caribbean nation is separated from the South American continent by two narrow channels, each only 10 kilometers wide. Like its close neighbor Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago is an oil-rich country, which has been among the most prosperous territories of the West Indies for about 150 years. About half the population resides in the urban east-west corridor, stretching east from the coastal capital, Port of Spain. This is where most of the COVID-19 cases have been located. Trinidad and Tobago has experienced strict enforcement of public health measures since March 2020. These have had a particularly noticeable impact on so-called liming, a fundamental component of social life on the islands. Liming is both an activity and an attitude, a ritualized practice, but one with few stable rules, although it usually involves eating, drinking, dancing, and storytelling. It operates through spontaneous, informal, and novel reconfigurations of collective action in space. Liming is based on playfulness, humor, and freedom. As we shall illustrate, the everyday practice of liming contributes to the production of the urban commons. Indeed, liming is a prime example of commoning, as defined by architect and theorist of the commons, Stavros Stavridis. He defines commoning as a practice of doing in common. Understood as a form of commoning, then, liming is a means to claim and appropriate space outside of any prevailing authority. Everywhere can be a place to lime, and thus liming occurs both in public spaces such as parks and beaches, and private clubs or residences. Trinbagonians practice commoning through liming. We consider liming to be a form of commoning par excellence, that is, a set of ritualized common practices structured through tacit common norms that enable the appropriation of urban space as a common resource.
Empirical observations highlight the epidemic's mixed impact on liming, which include curtailment, adaptation, and persistence of the practice. During the initial lockdown phase, locks were placed on public spaces such as Lord Harris and Woodford Squares to prevent social gathering. To date, many of these locks remain in place. Police removed persons who illegally gathered in public spaces. This translated to empty streets, squares, and promenades, which are usually the focal points of liming in major urban centers. Legislation focused on limiting gatherings on beaches, and along rivers, streams, and springs, all desirable liming locations. Frequent police patrols sought to control mask wearing and distancing, dispensing rewards in the form of vouchers or punishment through fines. Restrictions imposed on public liming locations shifted many limes to private residences. This raised legal issues for the implementation of COVID-19 restrictions, which now had to be applied within the private domain. Disparities were observed with police raiding so-called popular zesta parties, while large upscale weddings were allowed to take place. Although illegal, street vending is an integral part of the commons in Trinidad and Tobago. It is also often associated with curbside liming. Vending on the popular Charlotte Street in Port-of-Spain was shut down in March, while other vendors were relocated to a market area to ensure regular sanitization and physical distancing. In mid-May, the easing of regulations allowed street vendors and restaurants to resume curbside pickup and takeaway services. The need to ensure physical distancing and frequent sanitizing led to the retooling of public spaces. Common features included the installation of signage, physical barriers, and outdoor sinks. These can be seen as material expressions of the commons as threshold spaces and sites of encounter that were now being mediated through physical devices. Street food vendors were directed to prohibit their customers from congregating and consuming meals on site. This led to the emergence of creative alternatives that allowed limers to reappropriate the urban commons. Indeed, with little public seating available, car parks emerged as sought-after liming locations. For example, in the Etihad Savannah Park, sitting inside with doors open or in the vehicle trunk, limers enjoyed street food while socializing with their neighbors.
Throughout the pandemic, sidewalks remained favored liming locations. Although all Trinis lime, no matter their age, race, ethnicity, religion, or socioeconomic status, liming retains a classist and gendered character. When liming takes place on street corners and the limers are young Black men, it can be perceived as idling or loitering. However, liming can be productive, since it may provide useful information about the availability of wage labor. As a form of commoning, it is a means to cope with the harsh conditions of urban life. In conclusion, this case study has offered us the opportunity to confront urban commons theory with specific issues raised by the COVID-19 pandemic in a small island nation. It has illustrated the resilience of liming and the urban commons in the face of the COVID-19 shock. We suggest the resilience of liming may be due to certain characteristics that could be promoted in other forms of urban commons, namely flexibility and adaptability, few institutionalized rules, and an ability to take place in a multiplicity of spaces, whether public or private. Moreover, COVID-19 has highlighted how adaptations to the urban commons may be beneficial beyond the pandemic. Some of the sanitary adaptations already put in place, such as outdoor sinks and transparent barriers, may remain in place since many view them as overall improvements. They also point to other low-cost interventions that could improve common spaces, such as walls, rails, seatings, water outlets, and public toilets. These types of urban design interventions support the urban commons as a space of thresholds and a site of encounter with others. Thank you for your attention. This paper proposes.
Our next presenters are of a group of three, but Frederick Cameron will be the speaker. He's a city planner with a double PhD degree within the European Joint Doctorate Urban History, awarded by the Universidad de Valladolid in the Department of Urbanism and Representation of Architecture, as well as the Bauhaus University. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Culture at the University of Venice. The second contributor is Luca Maria Francesco Fabrice, a journalist and architect who obtained an architectural and environmental technology and a master in urban planning and environment. They're a distinguished expert at the Beijing University of Civil Engineering and Architecture and associate professor in environmental design at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Politecnico di Milano. Finally, Riccardo Maria Balzarati is an architect and partner of the Milanese architectural firm AOUMM, founded in 2012, developing many designs and research projects at different scales, such as the first prize an international design competition for pedestrian bridge in Milan. He is currently a fellow researcher at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Politecnico di Milano, focusing on the revitalization of the Italian community cinemas.
Hello everybody, this presentation deals with Superblock's experience in Barcelona, Spain as a promising pandemic response. This work has been carried out in collaboration with Luca Maria Francesco Fabrice and Riccardo Maria Balzarotti, with the objective of delineating the potential role that a superblock may play in mitigating the negative effects of COVID-19. This work presents the change occurred in Poblenou superblock unit having effect in contrasting the pandemic. This analysis comprises a desk research activity together with a fieldwork in September 2020 based on 15 residents and 15 non-residents interviews, a statistical reference sample indicated by the local association Poblenou Veïns i Veïnes. Superblock is though as a social unit, a tight-knit community with shared common facilities, resilient against the stresses of climate change and social vulnerability. This experiment regards the grouping of 9 square shade blocks of Cerdas extension, resulting in a standardized 400 square meters urban cell each, with an average of 5,500 inhabitants, including public open spaces, such as streets, sidewalks, and at least a square. The forecast impact of superblocks on Barcelona citizens' quality of life expected to mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19 through the following improvements. The first application of superblocks took place in 2016 in Poblenou to create a neighborhood unit located in the northeastern part of Barcelona. During the quarantine and the slow reopening, all interviewees valued positively the new urban environment features, as they have strengthened the sense of community, security, safety, and well-being, plus the necessity for Barcelona to invest on a public health-friendly urban design. As confirmed by the survey conducted in late September 2020, the implementation of superblocks have thus effectively operated on health and socio-economic inequities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And here we can see some images of this neighborhood unit, empty and with people wearing masks. The reasons that confirm us that superblocks operating on health and socio-economic inequities are the following. The measures adopted in Poblenou, such as the restrictions on speed limits and higher parking costs, reduce the tendency to drive and thereby encourage the use of bicycles and public transport, thus improving mental and physical health associated with lower levels of pollution and traffic. Second, superblocks tackle COVID issues by cutting space for private vehicles, incorporating new walkable spaces with well-connected streets, providing easy access to shops and services, and making public spaces friendly for residents and city users. By doing so, by mitigating the negative effects of density, the superblock increased the sense of community and the social sustainability, even during the lockdown, improving the performance, flexibility, and durability of the spaces individuals and families could occupy, respecting the social distances. Thirdly, Despite local residents' worries about price increasing as direct result of the improvements introduced in the neighborhood, market values seems to follow the general real estate trend, unaffected by the superblock operating change. Moreover, the new Catalan law on urgent measures on rent containment in housing contracts of September 2020 will control the prices so as not to increase disproportionately. Also, governance issues in the short, medium, and long terms are the following. First, superblocks require a considerable budget availability to expand them in the entire city due to the high cost of implementation. The first superblock in Poblenou costed 3.5 million euros, while the amount spent for Sant Antoni neighborhood unit rised up to 8 million euros. The lack of open debate with citizens in Poblenou caused protests against the poor involvement of local residents. The launching of the successive superblocks, such as the Sant Antoni ones, have been accompanied by open debates with citizens. Thirdly, the overlapping of Poblenou unit to the existing built environment implied two types of issues. The mobility system showed incoherence when it changed the traffic flows without implementation in the whole system, and bicycle lanes were not fully relocated, thus generating conflicts between pedestrians and cyclists. Moreover, no underground parking replaced the removed parking lots. So, the lesson learned is that superblocks can be intended as a specific form of tactical urbanism. In fact, superblocks adapt urban design, reclaim public spaces for citizens, rethink location of essential urban functions, reduce traffic, and enhance cycling and walkable facilities. And we understand that the basic principles of superblocks have countered the negative impact of COVID-19 by making the neighborhood units more inclusive, resilient, sustainable, and safer. But despite the fact that superblocks pertain to the pre-pandemic period, this model has relevance beyond the crisis, and superblock may provide thus feasible solution for the post-COVID-19 city to be applied carefully, case by case, in other contexts.
Our next set of presenters, we'll have one speaker and one co-author. Musa Al-Nayadi is an architectural engineer with a Master of Science in Architectural Engineering from the United Arab Emirates University. Currently, she is working as a head section of the Supervision on Maintenance and Construction Projects of UAE Missions Abroad in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. She has been awarded several times, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation Excellence Award under the Distinguished Engineer category, most recently in December of 2018. Khairat Al-Aoun is currently a professor of sustainable architecture and chair of the Architectural Engineering Department at the United Arab Emirates University in Al Ain. Khairat draws from 25 years of international academic and professional experience in the US, North Africa, and Middle East. She is engaged in education and practice-based research focusing on advancing the design and execution of sustainable, socio-culturally sensitive built environment in hot climatic zones. Her performance buildings and human factors in the built environment are her major areas of expertise, research, and publication. Khaira holds a PhD in building science from Sheffield University, and she was a Fulbright scholar at Arizona State University in the US. She's also a LEED accredited professional.
The conventional and well-established workplace and working modalities may be drastically challenged more than any other building sector, following the disruptive and instant changes imposed by the recent global pandemic. It forced government to impose drastic mobility and distanciation measures, which as a result caused complete disruption to the office employee work experience. At a minimum, the pandemic is likely to change or accelerate the existing trends, such as the working model, but it may also inspire technological advances related to health and satisfaction of building occupants. So truly, the workplace is venturing into a grand social experiment territory that may lead to questioning the need of the office as we know it and its future format that has yet to be framed. The aim of the research is to explore and identify the impacts of the current coronavirus pandemic on the workplace and its users' concerns, experiences, satisfaction, and expectations. The main purpose is to investigate how the pandemic may be shifting the work model and what may be its implication in workplace design. Hence, the objective explored three main aspects. First, it investigated the employees' concerns and fears about returning to the workplace. Second, it assessed the impact of the pandemic on work model preferences and productivity. And third, it questioned the participants' expectation for the future of office design and layout. This study took place in Abu Dhabi, the capital of United Arab Emirates. The UAE may be a small country, but it has witnessed a tremendous economic and urban growth with a high density of office spaces. So the objective were investigated through a survey carried among the employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the UAE, based in Abu Dhabi, and was conducted during the first 3 weeks of November 2020, gathering a total of 68 respondents. The results showed, understandably, that the main concerns of the participants were related to health implications of their families and themselves. This kind of challenges is timely and may be reduced or eliminated once the virus declines. The most striking result, despite the no preparation for such rapid shift, was the overwhelming preferences for a full switch to either working from home, as expressed by 26% of respondents, or a mixed working model with 2 days from home and the rest from office, prepared by 57% of participants. And this highlights an overwhelming majority preference for a hybrid working model. Further, the results also showed that while the respondents were working from home, they were more or equally productive compared to their productivity in the physical workplace, while positively enabling them to keep a better work-life balance. On the other hand, the most missed work aspect while working remotely was interacting and meeting with the co-workers, or in other terms, the interactive social dimension of work. The immediate impact on office design is understandably the preference for increased distance between workstation and more private offices. In conclusion, the rapid shift opened the doors to look for the possibility to accommodate a new work model of where personal versus work life can strike a better balance. So what does the workplace survey tells us about the future of the office work and the workplace? Well, first of all, it tells us that we are moving toward hybrid or flexible working model, since the results showed that people can work efficiently and comfortably from home, but they do miss the opportunities for interaction and socializing, and this fact cannot be ignored. So this means that the lesson learned from the experience of working from home during COVID-19 offer an unexpected opportunity to rethink of the future of work and the design of the workplace. It suggests to think of different forms. For example, first, it will ultimately incite the need of drawing new guidelines of workplace design and office layouts to satisfy occupants' needs and address the requirement of safety and sustainability. For example, co-working or shared office spaces. Secondly, to allocate more square footage per employee than existing building, with some offices potentially gravitating to more individual office space rather than open floor plans, and with a prime focus on meeting places that calls for a diverse layout and furnishing. Secondly, it also calls for innovative technologies for realistic virtual meetings and inspire technological advances related to health and wellness of building occupants. Thirdly, the need of integration of biophilic design, incorporation of natural elements and material, also using possibly outdoor, such as patios or courtyard as a workspace. Finally, the future of work and the workplace are challenged in an unprecedented way, calling for designers and researchers to explore, rethink, repurpose, and recreate the workplace.
The next presenter is one speaker and one co-contributor. Ross T. Smith is a senior lecturer in architecture at Deakin University in Australia. He completed a bachelor and master's degree in New Zealand and a PhD at the University of Melbourne, and was awarded a postdoctoral research fellowship in Paris. His theoretical and teaching focus is phenomenology and experiential learning in architectural design studios. Smith is also a practicing artist who exhibits internationally. His co-contributor is Cecilia de Marinis. She's a lecturer in architecture at Deakin University, also in Australia. She completed her PhD studies in sustainable urban design at the University of Roma and was a postdoctoral research fellow at RMIT University in Melbourne. She practiced as a registered architect in Italy and Spain. Her research interests are in the urban transformation, public space dynamics, and the interplay between people and space.
Hello, my name is Ross T. Smith, and I'm presenting on behalf of Cecilia de Marinis as well. I'll be discussing a Master of Architecture studio that Cecilia and I taught last year, entitled On the Verge. The provocation considers thresholds and edge conditions as physical and psychological barriers, boundaries, and transformational positions determined by materiality, physicality, ecology, and sensory perception. The reason I'm talking about this is because experiential learning is the focus of this teaching that we're doing. The purpose was to produce an architectural intervention integrating the landscape and a building. The project site and influence was an abandoned powerhouse in an urban industrial landscape. It was chosen for its prominence in the region of the university, which is near Melbourne, and has easy access for students to do experiential and phenomenological site analysis. Now, the university's response to COVID was that we went into complete lockdown and all classes went online almost immediately. However, we had 1 week before lockdown that students could come to the university, to the site and do some site analysis. However, in Victoria, we've been in Victoria, the state of Australia, we've been in lockdown most of the year. And about 2 months ago, lockdown was lifted mostly, and there's almost no COVID cases here anymore. And so life has become quite normalized. So this is a good thing. However, there's still the tension of having to work carefully and either work online or in physical studio, depending on the situation as it progresses. So site analysis, these are some images from the site. We teach very much from a phenomenological, experiential, and ecological point of view in studios here, and these are some images I took of the site. And we extended the site, the physical land site, 50 meters into the ocean, to give the students a greater sense of threshold and edge condition experience that we were looking for. And we can see some of the work the students produced down here in site analysis. Now, phenomenology, according to Eugene Fink, a while ago, he said, there's wonder in the face of the world, which is quite a great way to talk about the simplicity that we can approach the world with, or the complexity, depending on how much we focus. Now, phenomenology is detailed observation of nature, objects, humanity, and the constructed environment. It's about sensory perception and the presence of self, ephemera conditions, and the unexpected. And I teach the phenomenological theory and philosophy in relation to architecture from years of developing this, and so this becomes an important driver of the studio. So this slide also, and the 3 slides after it, show students' work that is process or final outcomes of the studio. Now, experiential learning is when integrated with phenomenology, takes the sort of theory, the pedagogical theory of constructivism, which is about students taking their own responsibility for their learning, about driving the process themselves, and they become very active learners as opposed to passive learners. And this is sort of crucially important when dealing with experiential learning. Experiential learning is a body-mind integration, sort of getting out of the computer, which is such a big thing these days, getting the students embodied back into their bodies and the physicality of being. By thinking, knowing, and acting, we become experiential learners. It's about getting your hands dirty, which is sort of some students are reluctant to do these days. So, you know, the physicality of being in a space and being in a site and you know, being amongst materials. And also, one thing I strongly support and value is experimentation, risk-taking, and fun in the studio. The more students experiment and take risks, the more they're letting go of the sense of being correct and getting things right, and trying to discover what the teacher wants, not what they want. And having fun is really important. Education's got to be about fun, otherwise it's a bit boring for all of us. So the important aspect of experiential learning in a physical studio is the ability to create dynamic and energy amongst a group of people. This strongly aids peer cohesion and learning and a sense of identifying with a particular studio's direction. Now, peer cohesion is something we've really sort of lost a little bit on the online system, where the sense of all being together physically in a studio, students can sort of integrate and work with each other and learn from each other very directly, whereas online it doesn't seem to happen. And the sudden move to online teaching meant that I personally lost the ability to read body language and read the feel of the room full of students, and the ability to quietly observe and observe the work being done by students and to develop discussions based on these observations. So that sense of the embodied physical environment, you know, was lost online. That's sort of being able to watch and carefully attend to things that popped up, you know, in the space. So online, we had to create new types of experience for students to explore. You encourage them to use their imagination of how a digital event could be experienced in reality. And this is quite a shift for students, like moving into their imagination more, and get them to reflect upon experience and get them to sort of write and talk about what they were experiencing and how they imagined things to be experienced, which is an important aspect. Now, the outcomes for the studio were, there's some of the images as well. And this one at the bottom here by Jack Brown is wacky, but it really was based on biophilia, and a very strong ecological research principles were taken to get to this point. So it was quite a fun experiment. This is where experimentation becomes so important in the studio. So experiential learning is essential to architecture design studio teaching because of the physical nature of the learning style. Studio is one class that needs to remain in the realm of human contact in order to deeply engage with the embodied material and physical world. However, the things that were a problem, you know, with online teaching as opposed to physical was the lack of intimacy and the intimate integration between teachers and students, and the really getting to know each other in the real world, I suppose, as to be online. One of the things that students did have to do, they had to become more independent and less and resolve issues themselves, which was important. And the hybrid teaching was a discussion we had with students, where the thought was that being partly online and partly in physical studio would be a really good way of teaching studio. So this year, our academic year starts here in February. So something I'm going to explore more of how to create a stronger studio environment with an online physical combination. So that's the end of experiential learning in the studio. Important and necessary in all teaching, I believe. So thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Our final presentation is by Aki Yoshida, who is an associate professor of architecture at Virginia Tech. They received their MS in Advanced Architectural Design from Columbia University, and her build projects explore interactive lighting and participatory design, and her publications examine architectural materials in a broader cultural and social contexts.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, face coverings and partitions that protect people from the virus have enabled individuals to connect by distancing the air they breathe. On February 27th, the World Health Organization published a recommendation to install transparent barriers of glass or acrylic in order to conserve the need for personal protective equipment, or PPE. These barriers perform three functions: to intercept the droplets that carry the virus, to remind people of physical distancing requirements, and to reduce reliance on masks when there is a shortage of PPEs. By mid-March, as schools and the offices abruptly locked down, physical barriers quickly appeared in order to flatten the curve of infection rates. No longer limited to medical spaces, clear acrylic barriers were erected to protect the health of employees and customers at cashiers' counters, taxis, buses, post offices, and banks. Plexiglass barriers can remind people of high security, stressful interactions, such as sitting in the back seat of police cars or visiting an incarcerated family member at a prison. Like masks, these barriers have been introduced as an emergency public health measure. However, social implications of these interventions remain largely unconsidered and demand attention. I will present three examples of protective barriers: partitions in offices, partitions in retail shops and restaurants, and face coverings. As people returned to work over the summer, office furniture companies quickly speculated a surge in sales of plexiglass partitions. While barriers can induce a sense of protection, they also result in a sense of separation, obstacle, and hierarchy. An interior full of transparent barriers may resemble scenes from Jacques Tati's 1967 film, Playtime, in which the main character becomes befuddled and lost in the world of modern office cubicles and endless reflections. Over the past couple of decades, companies have removed partitions between employees in order to create less hierarchical, more open, egalitarian office environments conducive to collaborations. Now these barriers may need to be revived for public health. In doing so, companies must be mindful of how these barriers may create unintended hierarchies and obstructions for communication. On September 30th of this year, New York City allowed its restaurants to open indoor dining at 25% capacity. In order to provide more tables that are better ventilated, many eateries expanded their seating to the sidewalks or the parking lanes, activating public life on the street during the summer and fall. However, as cold weather arrived, many restaurants covered outdoor tables with plastic bubble dining pods, which raised public health concerns that these may be incubators for virus transmission. In these dining pods, the transparent barriers that are intended to protect can be deceptive. While the plastic bubbles are located outside of buildings without natural or mechanical ventilation, they're not any safer than indoor seating. In fact, dining in these bubbles can pose more risk than indoor seats. Dr. Lindsay Marr, professor of civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech and an airborne disease transmission expert, says, if someone's infected, there's really a high potential for virus to build up in the air and for everybody in that little bubble to be exposed. Dr. Marr suggests using the bubble only with one's own social pod. Scientific studies have shown that wearing of masks is one of the most effective preventions against the virus. Hiding one's face, however, presents communication concerns. Opaque masks conceal facial expressions and body language that convey emotions. Seeing gestures and mouth movements is more equitable for people with hearing difficulties. Although transparent facial masks have been designed in response to these issues, Even a clear material is a barrier. Sounds are muffled, tactility is lost, and reflections on the surface can obstruct vision. There appears to be a great potential and need for developments in wearable ambulatory barriers that connect people socially and emotionally while protecting them from the airborne virus. Sociologist Richard Sennett speculates that social distancing practices will outlast the pandemic due to a learned fear of the invisible. He bases this on examples of security measures practiced immediately after 9/11, such as ID checking and X-ray scanning at building entries and airports that remained the norm decades after the terror attack. As we learn more about COVID-19, we have learned from scientists that some practices, such as incessant wiping down of surfaces, are ineffective, and that others, such as the plastic bubbles with sealed air, present risks. The new normals during and after a pandemic need to be examined critically. Instead of relying solely on physical barriers, how could we combine the barriers with spatial arrangements of seats and improved ventilation, or carefully consider integrating surveillance and contact tracing? Observations of US cities in the last 9 months have uncovered a need to carefully monitor social and emotional impacts of protective barriers as we shield ourselves from the invisible virus.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for great presentations. I just have a few short comments, and then I'll happily open up to Q&A. So if you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A box there. So to begin, I just want to reflect on these projects and note that separately, perhaps they seem as isolated case studies, but really together they are a lesson in adaptation, and they inspire new ways for us to look at our COVID and our post-COVID world. Importantly, these adaptive responses show us how in the Liming case we can reimagine social interactions, how in the superblocks we can reactivate public spaces, and in office spaces of Abu Dhabi we learn to rework interior design to suit pandemic and post-pandemic needs. And in the paper on protective barriers shows us how to reevaluate the effects and impacts of these personal protection equipment. And finally, the paper on experiential learning shows us how to recreate design and recreate spaces. So more specifically, on liming and commoning, I found that social interaction and engagement was an essential component of everyday life, but an unpredictable byproduct of this, this new kind of relocation of liming social locations was a sort of legitimization of the practice, and by change of location. In this way, this cultural event has become sort of an institutionalized event and recognized to some capacity by the government. In the superblock, we learned to reactivate these social spaces, and so social networks existed within these invisible barriers. While inherent design characteristics allowed for adaptation, the success is due to the community's exercise needs for social spaces within a shared space, and one that was insulated to external forces such as this COVID spread. And the workspaces in Abu Dhabi showed us the need to redesign according to a re-examination of productivity, efficiency, and importantly, physical comfort. We learned that we have to have a personal work-life balance, and more importantly, we have to respond to employees' needs and how they can feel that they can be more safe, healthful, and productive in their work. When we looked at protective barriers, we learned to reevaluate how we deal with responses. So in office partitions, restaurant bubbles, and face coverings, they're simply crisis solutions, but they force us to reevaluate this new normal, and more importantly, the implications of these design interventions and how they can impact people's everyday lives. And finally, though, going out of order, experiential learning teaches us how to recreate. So experiential learning allows us to put to practice these adaptive learning techniques that I spoke about previously. And by extension, they teach us to learn how to resituate ourselves physically in what is otherwise a predominantly virtual pandemic and post-pandemic life. In looking at these presentations, I wanted to ask several questions, and I will happily, of course, defer to the Q&A. But just thinking about the presentations, I wanted to understand how better to react to the problems that arise due to COVID limitations, and so how these protective barriers, for example, address the repercussions of crisis responses. And also I wanted to think about in the super blocks, if this was just a product of circumstance, if in fact the responses by the community were exclusive to that environment and they were therefore the most effective option, or simply that they were kind of helped along by the circumstances of this living environment. So I think I'll begin with a question for the team from Abu Dhabi. And we have a question about how they envision what workplaces will be like. And I'll add on to that question and say, if we could quickly reflect on what the workplace was like prior to COVID and then how you imagine the design will be now. I think that's for Musa or Khera. They're here.
Yeah, hi. So the question was how we are going to imagine the future of the workplace design is going to be. So first, the pandemic is continuing its risk over the world, and even now it's having more serious side effects. And in my point of view, first, the countries will accommodate the remote working and allow the people to work from home. And as a result shows that they had a lot of a more balanced work and life balance between them. And this will ultimately insights that then there is a need to draw a new guidelines of workplace design and office layout so to satisfy the occupants' needs and also to address the requirement of safety and sustainability. And also it's gonna put the hygiene at the heart of the designing. For example, and point of view of in designing for offices, we may allocate more square footage per employee than existing buildings, with some offices potentially gravitating to more individual office spaces rather than open floor plans. And with a primer focus on meeting places, as a result shows that people are missing the meeting places, gathering with people and to connect with their colleagues. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. No, that's perfect. It's a perfect response. Thank you very much. I think I'll just pop on ahead to a project that received a couple of questions. I'll begin first with Federico on the Superblock project, and then Nicole, I'll turn to you for a question on liming and commenting. So Federico, I think there's the question of, was this a product of circumstance, or was there something specific to the design of the Superblocks that really was sort of universal? A universe would address the COVID crisis. So if you could quickly just kind of speak to that. Oh, can you unmute yourself, please? Okay. Frederick, I'm going to come back to you in 1 minute. I'm going to pop on to Nicole for the Superblock question. I'm sorry, the liming question. I think that people wanted to understand what was the actual impact of this relocation of the sort of the social experience of liming, because I think we learned about how they were relocated and that spoke a lot to the social interactions, but didn't actually speak to the technical effects.
I think the material effects we tried to highlight were mostly the kind of physical barriers that were put in place. And what I thought was really interesting were also the outdoor sinks that were actually installed on sidewalks, which I think kind of points to potential for lots of such sanitary interventions, which could be useful past the time of COVID as well. I don't know if Renelle wants to add something. She's in Trinidad, so maybe she has something more specific to add.
Sure.
Maybe I can just add that during the period, the responses actually varied. So in the beginning, people adhered to rules that were set out. However, we noticed that people began to resist those rules a bit. When we realized that numbers were particularly low and people felt the sense of normalcy returning. So I think maybe that was an important part of the response as well, Not only did we pay attention to the rules and obey the rules, there began to be a form of resistance to the rules that were implemented.
I think that's a normal response in a lot of places. Thank you very much. Federico, are we able to return to you to answer that question about product of circumstance, or if in fact it was a creative response?
Yeah, excuse me, can you repeat please the question, as I couldn't heard due
Sure.
to problems to my Wi-Fi connection, please? Thank
Okay,
you.
sure, no problem. The question had to do with whether or not the success in limiting COVID spread in the superblock was just simply a product of design circumstance, or if in fact there was a specific creative solution that allowed for these communities to kind of endure without spreading the virus.
Yeah, well, this solution was thought as a pre-pandemic solution to improve environmental and climate change issues in the whole city. And as far as we conduct a survey in the late September, we found out that citizens, residents and non-residents in this superblock claim that this solution is a very good solution to improve the health of people, but there is no public survey on COVID-19 effects on population health during the last 11 months.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you think that this sort of the lifestyle, the superblock, or the design will continue to be maintained and or thrive and increase in other areas?
Yes, well, in the early November, the mayor Ada Colau promoted the extension of this measure in the most central district of Barcelona, that is called Eixample. It is the Cerdàs extensions, but there are in program 503 superblocks within the whole city. The problem is the financing of this operation, as they are really expensive. In Poblenou, it cost around 3.5 million euros, while in another place more than 8. So if you implement 5,000 superblocks, if you calculate it, you know, it's very expensive.
Quite an expense. Okay, thank you very much. Aki, I have a question for you, simply personal interest living in New York and seeing these sort of the restaurant bubbles pop up and shake my head and walk past. And you say that we have to understand the repercussions of these designs, but of course we have to enable social interactions to some capacity to maintain some sense of normalcy, whatever minimal it can be. What is your recommendation, either through personal PPE or the bubbles, or, you know, or barriers, whatever you think? Could you provide a thought on how we could better address these solutions?
Sure. I'm speaking as an architect and not as a medical professional, but I think many of us would agree that one of the benefits of having gone through this pandemic is activation of public spaces, outdoor public spaces. And it's, as urban planners or designers, it's been delightful to see our sidewalks and roads become activated, our parking spots replaced with outdoor seating. So I think it's been particularly difficult in winter because it's harder to be outside in cold weather. But if these shelters could be better ventilated, not as sealed up as some bubbles are, and if we could still keep our masks on when possible, I think there are ways to keep what's been beneficial socially while staying safe. Or that is my
for certain. I mean, if you came to walk through my neighborhood, you would have a serious anxiety attack with the number of restaurants are considered to be safe outdoor dining. But people need their sense of normalcy. I just have one more minute and a question that I want to ask, but I think it's also been asked in the Q&A to Ross for experiential learning. I think that if you could briefly speak to, hopefully Ross is here, if you could briefly speak to what you imagine active learning environment can be in the studio, if such a thing can actually happen, what will be the balance of online and in-person learning? We have less than a minute if you're there. I'm not sure, Caitlin, I don't think the panelist.
Not sure who else was able to join us today, unfortunately.
Okay, all right. So we'll save it for later then.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you so much to our first group of presenters. This is great. We're going to move on now to our second session today. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I wanted to say while I'm getting my screen pulled up that there have been a couple of questions in the Q&A about the view that's appearing for attendees. If you just go to see some of the answered questions, we put some instructions about how you can change your own view, and we are also working with things on our end as well. Let me just do this one more time. Okay. Okay, so our next session is titled Ecology and Sustainability, and it's impossible and indeed short-sighted to conceive of this current pandemic without recognizing the role that climate change has played in affecting the frequency and severity of epidemics, and how the same technologies of mass movement and consumption that contribute to environmental pollution and climate change also render us vulnerable to epidemic illness and make its effects more severe. In this session, we use the term ecology in a deliberately broad sense, referring not only to the natural and human-made systems that have contributed to and been affected by COVID, but also to the broader social and cultural prisms for which we can see, understand, and respond to COVID-19. Communities, for example, are one such ecological niche. Indeed, communities are both a source of infection and resilience, intervention and antidote. More broadly, papers in this session will explore the direct and indirect impacts of COVID-19 on urban and natural environments, sustainability, and environmental justice. We will hear case studies about social and ecological sustainability efforts in community schools in US contexts, as well as ecosystemic landscape interventions in Italy. Papers will also articulate the impacts of climate change and global warming on the susceptibility of urban and rural communities to infectious illness, showcase human and built responses to the impacts of these ecological issues, including thermally comfortable sidewalks in Argentina and socially resilient housing typologies in Rwanda. In some, papers will explore socio-ecological relationships, broadly defined in the ways they have shaped and been shaped by COVID responses. Moderating today's session is Dr. Michael G. Vann. Dr. Vann is professor of history at California State University, Sacramento. His research on the French colonial empire and the history of Southeast Asia during the Cold War has been published in several books and over 24 academic journal articles. His most recent book is The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, Empire, Disease, and Modernity in French Colonial Vietnam, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Dr. Vann's current research compares the representation of Cold War era mass violence in Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Indonesian museums.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin and Mohammed, for putting together this great symposium, and thank you to all the attendees around the world. This session on ecology and sustainability has 4 papers from 4 continents, reflecting the truly global nature of this event. Our first paper is from Andrea Oldani. It is entitled Landscape and Ecosystem Intensification Strategies During and After Pandemics in Milan, Italy. Dr. Oldani is an assistant professor of landscape architecture in the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at Politecnico di Milano, where he's a faculty member of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Construction Engineering. He earned a PhD in Architectural and Urban Design from the Department of Architecture and Planning. His research on the landscape of contemporary infrastructure has been published in a number of scientific journals.
The recent past has been marked by ecological criticalities and environmental urgencies that the COVID-19 pandemic had in some ways the merit of pulling out even more strongly. One of these issues is the weakness and fragility of dense, congested, and polluted areas, deeply rooted in pandemic's dynamics. The case that I bring to the conference attention is related to Milan in northern Italy. In this context, it is evident the problem of air pollution and the high density. These two conditions have negatively influenced the spread and severity of COVID-19 since the pandemic's first phase. It must be remarked that people debilitated by continuous contact with air pollutants are more prone to severe pulmonary consequences due to viral and bacterial diseases. The maps presented show a precise correspondence between places and pandemic phenomena, offering several insights for those involved in urban architectural and landscape design.
It appears clear how these criticalities involve landscape architecture as a discipline capable of reading existing conditions, highlighting figures, dynamics, pros and cons, and defining the strategical points around which gather a variety of expertise for an interdisciplinary strategical project. In this scenario, a sort of design hope lies in the possibility of redeeming an uncertain present for a more livable future, more resilient also to pandemics.
The 38-kilometer axis of the northwest drainage canal, running from the dense diffuse periphery at the north of Milan to the Ticino River on the west side, results in the meantime as a cutting and a connection in the mosaic of residual open spaces in the metropolitan conurbation, including agricultural parks and some relevant natural areas. The research assumes the controversy and ambiguity of this forgotten line as an opportunity in a vast and complex mosaic whose recycling is fundamental for the future of the environment, the safeness, and the possibility of inhabiting these areas. Under those circumstances, it's essential to build a framework of knowledge and visions capable of offering new perspective on this line and the systems that it crosses. The goal is to imagine how an artifact without any architectural value and a contested infrastructure that is also a vehicle for heavy forms of pollution can be redeemed through a project capable of making it the backbone of a landscape of diversity. This can happen through a series of actions capable of changing the image and the overall sense of this infrastructure. The study of the landscape in its complexity and variety allows a summary of the dominant components. These fields become the physical and problematic contexts within which developing visions and forms of the invention. It is evident the coexistence of values like reserves and fragments of diversity, blue-green networks, and weaknesses like grounds of urban dispersion, grids and nodes of the diffused metropolis. That character coexists together with agricultural productive spaces, characterized by a controversial role because their ecological dimension is not meaningful as commonly perceived. The brief analysis allows the first draft of strategies for a more resilient ecosystem oriented to diversity intensification, environmental reparation, and innovation. Some primary actions, like the care and completion of the Green Corridor, as well as the intensification of the reserves of diversity, can be combined with attempts to compensate the loss of some agricultural land in favor of natural diversity through new forms of controlled or innovative productions. For example, vertical farming. Those strategies answer in different ways to the existing conditions, balancing the role of wide open spaces, dense or less dense urban contexts. In this sense, a common and necessary goal is to eliminate bounds between urban spaces and the canal, thinking to its inclusion in innovative types of public spaces, including plural infrastructures and some new architectural shapes for the collection and management of groundwater, wastewater, and rainwater.
I think this brief presentation is enough to highlight how the existing condition of urban and natural environments impact the effects of pandemic like COVID-19. The intent has been showing how some complex and forgotten infrastructure can assume a fundamental role in reassessing metropolitan areas' susceptibility to the spread of infectious illness. It emerges a vision for a challenging program on the landscape. Some traditional growth mechanisms could change, considering the preeminence of essential ecosystem services that can result from a careful landscape design. somehow suggested by the pandemic's severe effects and dynamics. Let us remember that pandemics' frequencies also depends on the quality and honesty with which humanities relates to the environment.
Our next session, our next paper is from the United States. The team is composed of Rebecca Milne, Sean O'Donnell, and Bruce Levine. The title is Communities, Schools, and Future Ecologies in Washington, D.C. Rebecca Milne is Director of Design Strategy at Perkins Eastman. Rebecca is a graduate of McGill University with bachelor's degrees, plural, in psychology with an emphasis on neuropsychology and art history. She received her master's in interior design from the Pratt Institute and a master of architecture from Boston Architectural College. As a published researcher, Rebecca has pioneered several studies examining collaboration and individualization in workplace, healthcare, and education environments. Sean O'Donnell is the practice area leader for Perkins Eastman's International K-12 practice and the co-director of the Consortium for Design and Education Outcomes, a research partnership with Drexel University's School of Education. Sean received his Master of Architecture from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is deeply committed to sustainable school design and has served as a juror for numerous school design competitions, authored articles and presented internationally, and his projects have won more than 30 awards. And Bruce Levine is Associate Clinical Professor of Education Policy at Drexel University's School of Education and Director of the Education Policy Program at that school. He obtained his JD from New York University. His scholarship encompasses issues of equity and access in American education, including development of community school models and the relationship of school design to education and community outcomes.
With the COVID-19 pandemic still having tragic consequences for our societies and dramatic implications for our schools, we've become acutely aware of the value of the educational environment, not only to individuals, but to the sustainability and the ecosystem of our communities. Recognizing the knowledge required to develop appropriate environmental design responses and the complexity, we've assembled an interdisciplinary team of architects and academic researchers from Perkins Eastman and Drexel University, and together we've spent the last 9 months exploring these emerging ideas and continue to do so. The first thing we've recognized is that it's not one crisis, not just COVID, that we need to address. There are at least 4 parallel crises occurring: to health and well-being for sure, but also economic recession, the movements for social justice, most prominently Black Lives Matter, and overarching global warming and sustainability concerns. These 4 crises are occurring simultaneously, causing immense stress to societal systems that we rely upon. Rather than simply dealing with only one of these complex issues at a time, we're faced with a pandemic that has caused existing economic, social, and environmental concerns to heighten, requiring multidisciplinary and multifaceted responses.
COVID and the parallel crises has really disrupted every aspect of the way we work and live. Education in particular has experienced profound disruption. To help navigate these changes, we've engaged in research both independently and in collaboration with schools, parents, and teachers and educators, investigating the impact not just on COVID-19 on educational institutions, but on students, families, and communities, which are all linked. Our methods include an online survey for parents and students, roundtable discussions with academic clients, and ongoing research to identify trends, challenges, and opportunities for the future of education design. The findings of our research really underscore the interconnectedness of the public education system with social, environmental, economic, and public health factors. Not surprisingly, we found that the impact of the switch from in-person to remote learning to be significant on both students and parents. Beyond the obvious issue of learning loss, with around 60% of students learning less than usual, we also found to have profound effects on our social and emotional well-being. Social development is not easily transferred to virtual settings, particularly for younger children. Schools are not just a source for education, but they provide valuable resources and services for families like childcare, nutritious meals, mental health services, and more. Most students have noted that they feel more stressed and isolated from friends since stay-at-home orders, and they also feel less confident in their ability to learn from home. Um, They feel a lot lonelier, 34% feeling lonelier, and 88% of parents have also identifying that feeling isolated from their friends has really impacted their child's learning experience at home. We think that without the support services typically provided by schools, children are more vulnerable to stress and learning loss. Our key takeaways from our research can be summarized as the following. Remote learning doesn't necessarily replace classroom learning. The classroom is so essential to learning that we really feel that it's really important for us to address this as we look to future models. Socialization is crucial to education. We really learn a lot from being with our peers, teachers, and mentors, and that's also really important to both the social and emotional development and to our learning outcomes as well. With everything we're seeing, we're also predicting that learning models will be shifting. With all the complex balance of demands that we're seeing, it will be interesting to see how it plays out in the months and years to come. And most importantly, schools are at the heart of our community. In times of crisis, communities turn to schools for support, hope, and shelter and sustenance. Schools really provide essential resources to the community at large, but especially to students, many of whom don't have these resources available to them in other forms. Due to the changes brought on by COVID-19 in our educational system, educational delivery has changed and evolved, and schools will need to address these changes, which in turn will positively impact our communities.
Among the factors inspiring change in school design include emphasizing indoor environmental quality factors and their impact on educational outcomes, health, and wellness, accelerating the implementation of one-to-one educational technology and associated applications, increasing blended learning within a hybrid educational model, making education more accessible to all learners, expanding synchronous and asynchronous blended learning pedagogies, and increasing interest in community schools, expanding services and resources provided to students, families, and the community. Many of these issues existed either as mainstream or emerging ideas prior to the COVID crisis, but now there's an increased urgency to act. Challenges in reopening schools, particularly in under-resourced urban areas, has underscored the need to provide equitable facilities across all of our communities. And understanding that this crisis is tied directly to climate change bolsters the need to dramatically reduce the impact of our buildings on the environment. With virtually everyone sensitized to the influence of school infrastructure now on not only the health and wellness of our students and teachers, but on the community as a whole, we need to create schools that dramatically enhance wellness as well. Just as many of these ideas existed before the crisis, there are already some models of this next generation school emerging. One example is West Elementary School, illustrated here. Currently under construction, it's targeted to become the first net zero energy and WELL certified school in the world. This combination means that its design and building systems not only conserve resources, in this case, the building generated more energy than it consumes, but that its sustainable design also has directly targeted creating a healthy, high-performance place to learn. Indoor environmental quality factors, ranging from daylight, enhanced acoustics, thermal comfort, to indoor air quality, can enhance learning outcomes. And considering COVID, enhanced ventilation not only improves cognitive function, but it also has a positive influence on health and well-being. Another conclusion arising from our research during the pandemic is that wellness should not only focus on the individual as it has traditionally. As creatures living within a complex, interconnected, local and global ecosystem, we need to focus on the wellness and resilience of our communities and the environments and places that we reside within. This leads us to consider the expansion of the school's role as a central resource in a more holistic approach to wellness to truly become community schools.
Education researchers have begun to document the beneficial impacts of community school models, which, with appropriate funding and policy support, can sustainably provide integrated student supports and wraparound services. The community schools approach consists both of creating a particular kind of place and a set of partnerships. To date, most of the places have been essentially retrofitted into school buildings that were originally built as a traditional collection of classrooms, hallways, offices, and a few gathering spots. Moving forward, we need to envision and construct flexible physical spaces that can support health and social services and youth and community development activities, among other things, and that are open beyond 8 to 3 on weekdays. They also must accommodate the community partnerships that are not only focused on academic achievement, but on meeting community needs, which can range from food distribution to civic activities like voting and candidate forums. In other words, serving as a hub in the ecosystem of a community.
For our next paper, we'll be leaving the winter of the Northern Hemisphere and going to the summer of the Southern Hemisphere. This is relevant as this paper is entitled Urban Form and Thermally Comfortable Streetscapes in Post-COVID Mendoza, Argentina. We have a team of 3 presenters from Argentina on this paper. The speaker will be Maria Belén Sosa, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Environment, Habitat, and Energy in Mendoza, Argentina. She obtained her PhD in science at Universidad Nacional de Salta, Argentina. She has published about the relationship between urban form and outdoor thermal conditions, with a focus on bioclimatic urbanism. On this project, she was joined by Erika Correa, a chemical engineer with a PhD in science and renewable energy, who's a researcher and professor at National Technological University in Argentina, and Maria Alicia Canton, an architect with a DAE in architecture and university professor in Mendoza University and a researcher in Argentina.
Hi everyone, I am presenting our work from Argentina. Early research on the impacts of COVID on cities is mainly related to 4 themes: environmental quality, socioeconomic impacts, management and governance, and transportation and urban design. Our work at the Institute of Environment, Habitat and Energy in Mendoza, Argentina, has been focused on urban form design, as we consider it a powerful tool to achieve more livable communities in the post-COVID age. Particularly in arid zones where the extreme weather conditions in summer decrease the use of outdoor spaces. The Mendoza metropolitan area is located in an arid zone west of Argentina. The image of the bottom shows the location of Mendoza in the South American continent. Besides the forested streets, Mendoza is uncomfortable during summertime. Urban warming affects the outdoor and indoor thermal conditions, decreasing the use of outdoor spaces and increasing the use of energy consumption. Our methodology consists in developing 48 urban design scenarios on neighborhood scale. We tested 24 base scenarios and 24 optimized scenarios that combine 3 strategies to reduce this urban warming, that are the design of the urban form layout of the neighborhoods, the trees, and the material salvage. We use 3 main procedures to predict the results of these different scenarios. First one, we select the neighborhood where the macroclimatic monitoring campaign were made. With this data, we adjust simulations made by using Epidemic software. Our final research shows that the urban warming strategy used improves the outdoor thermal conditions by decreasing 4.7 Celsius degrees the maximum air temperatures, 2.5 the minimum, and 3.4 the average air temperature. The thermal behavior graphic shows in gray lines the base cases and in the light blue lines the optimized cases. It can be noticed that the strategy used contributes to reduce these urban warming effects and decrease the outdoor air temperatures. Our design recommendations for achieve cooler communities are design neighborhood grids that contribute to decreases outdoor air temperature, Rectangular design shows us this is better. Regarding the street orientation for the south hemisphere, northwest and northwest-southeast orientations are the best. The street trees, we recommend second magnitude trees in blind pits each 6 meters. And the materials albedos, cool materials in all exposed surfaces, particularly in horizontal ones. Our concurrent thoughts for this post-COVID age are that the pandemic forced us to reassess the way we design and think our cities, rethinking the relationship between urban design and public health. By reducing outdoor air temperatures, streetscapes became more livable. This condition helped to increase the walkability and reduce the car and the public transportation dependency, conditions that contribute to decrease the COVID transmission. Thank you so much. Hi everyone.
Okay, for our final paper, we are staying within the Southern Hemisphere, but just barely, just below the equator. And we're going to Rwanda, where Manolio Maciuletti will present his paper entitled Emergency Response Design in Housing Typologies in the Post-COVID Kigali, Rwanda. Dr. Maciuletti is a senior lecturer of architecture and the dean of the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Rwanda in Kigali. He obtained his PhD in architectural composition at the University of Venice, Italy. He has published various papers and book chapters and books on architectural heritage, urban design, and tropical architecture.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted to have the chance to present the research called Emergency Responsive Design in Housing Typologies in the Post-COVID Kigali, Rwanda. Why housing typologies? Because I do believe that architecture can still play an important role in fighting the spread of COVID or any other epidemic crisis, complying with the measures put in place by the different governments. The aim of the research is not just to compare two different housing types, the twin house and the apartment house during COVID lockdown, but above all to provide a way forward for the next urban development, identifying one precise housing type that better responded to the emergency, the ongoing emergency, and one possible method to compose this housing type in order to comply also with the adopted master plan guidelines that requires for Kigali to achieve a higher urban density. Briefly, the context. The context is the sub-Saharan region, and as you can see from the image on the right side of the slide, the continent is facing a rapid urban growth led by Cairo, Lagos, and Kinshasa. The so-called megalopolis, and Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda, is also experiencing a rapid growth, but located in the East African region. What is interesting for us is also to notice that architecture plays an important role at national and urban level. Why? Because the national government adopted a very specific development plan for the country, as you can see, a polycentric model. The country is structured in 6 secondary cities around the capital Kigali, and the capital Kigali is divided in 3 districts, and in each district there is a different satellite. Also, Kigali has a polycentric structure or a satellite city development plan. Gachuriro is the satellite placed on the north side of Kigali, and where also the two housing types are located. Kigali over time, in 1910, was just a German military compound. that in 1940 became just a small part of the structured city, and in 1990, before the dramatic events of 94, the genocide is part of a already dense urban structure. And now, as I said before, Kigali is experiencing a rapid urban growth, counting today a population of 1.2 million inhabitants. The Gachuriro satellite is composed by 3 different settlements: Kigali 2020, Kigali Vision, and Kigali Vision 2. The first 2 settlements are already completed. Kigali Vision 2 is under construction. The Kigali 2020 is designed as a regular sequence of 4 typologies of twin houses along the contours lines of the slope. Kigali Vision is characterized by different dwelling types, and for our research, we have just taken into consideration the apartment houses that are here down highlighted in black. Each unit of twin houses has a private outdoor space. You can see here highlighted in dark green, opposite to the condominium that share a vast common green area. As previously said, also the need of increasing the density pushed the municipality to privilege this last kind of buildings, the multi-story buildings. But during the 3 months of lockdown, the measures taken to prevent and stop the spread of the virus confined all the people at home. It's obvious that living in the twin houses that you can see here in this picture has the advantage of continuing a normal domestic life, even outside in the outdoor space, so important, also related to the local culture and tradition, but was really difficult to be achieved by people confined in the apartment building that were sharing just a small terrace, as you can see on the right side of the slide of this condominium elevation. Twin houses are also more flexible than the apartments. As you can see, they give the chance for the owners to expand the layout of the house, to add more space in the overall layout of the house, expanding the house footprint and customizing it according to different needs. For instance, having an extra space as office that can be utilized for smart working during the epidemic crisis. But the twin house can assure a good life quality during tough lockdowns, but we have to comply, as I said, with the current master plan. And so to adopt this type, I mean the twin house in the future settlements, it's necessary to find a way of increasing the density. Therefore, the research concludes proposing the Peter Behrens concept of Gruppenbauweise in order to group in the same area occupied by 2 houses, 7 units, and at the same time providing an adequate outdoor private space and an appropriate level of flexibility in changing the house layout.
Thank you for those wonderful papers. I have a few comments for the panel as a whole, and then a few questions for each of the individual papers. First, let me say that I'm very humbled to moderate your work. As a historian of colonial cities in Southeast Asia, I'm used to critiquing the work of architects and urbanists who are long dead. So to actually be in contact with living people is a new experience for me. Second, as I work on colonial urbanism, I was most struck by questions of political power in your papers. You all have wonderful ideas, but how might these agendas be implemented? Perhaps you could speak to the political context of each of your cases. I imagine it would be easier for technocrats to implement things in Kagame's somewhat authoritarian Rwanda than in the political chaos of the United States of America right now. And on a related note, I would love to hear about how these projects are sold to the general public in Italy, in Washington, D.C., in Argentina, in Rwanda. How do we get the general population on board with these programs? For Andrea Oldani, I was wondering if you could say a few words on canals gone wrong. I grew up in Honolulu next to the Alawai Canal. I've lived in Jakarta, Indonesia, and in Phnom Penh, and in Cambodia, and in Hanoi, all cities with once beautiful canals, which now are less than desirable and sometimes a public health hazard. What's involved in maintaining such environmental / urban infrastructure, and what needs to be done to ensure that these canals don't go wrong? For Team America, shall we say, I have a very American question. While your proposals for schools as community centers strike me as wonderful and remind me of some of the best aspects of life under socialist rule that I observed in suburban Shanghai and in Hanoi when I was living there, I worry about America's ongoing epidemic, not COVID-19, but the epidemic of gun violence. My daughter's public schools here in California have steadily been restricting access to campus. Indeed, we just had a big infrastructure project of building fences and restricting the number of entry points to the campus. How do we reconcile the school as public community center with the safety concerns raised by Columbine, Sandy Hook, and Parkland, to name just a few of the many tragic cases that we've had to deal with of on-campus violence? For Maria Sosa and the Argentinians, who are currently enjoying the summer as we freeze in the middle of winter, I'm curious about the use of greenery and urban maintenance. My university is in Sacramento, California, once known as the City of Trees. While it is very green, and the trees actually have a really excellent invisible impact of controlling the temperature on the street during the hot summers of the Central Valley, the trees pose a number of problems. In the winter storms, branches come crashing down and impact structures. As a cyclist, I've had to deal with massive leaf drops blocking the bike lanes in the fall, and various safety concerns that arise from that. And well, as a sufferer of allergies, I don't appreciate all the pollens. These may seem like somewhat petty complaints or cranks, but they do have an overall impact on the lived experience of the city. And I also think that's maybe sort of tied in to my question about how to enroll the public in this project. I'm also wondering if you could speak more to the issue of trying to retrofit urban centers with your designs for street and block orientation. What would be involved in that in, again, retrofitting the city. For Dr. Micheletto, I was wondering if you could say a few words on the difference between tropical architecture and non-tropical architecture. What's involved specifically in terms of tropical architecture and planning for disease. I know that Rwanda has done exceptionally well in the face of the current pandemic, sort of ranks up there with Vietnam as success stories. And is any of the urban planning that you've discussed related to these to the success? Again, I really enjoyed these papers. I love the optimism that they embody to make our cities better, more functional and healthier and more inclusive spaces after we get through COVID. So please don't take my critique as pessimism or negativity. So if the presenters would unmute themselves and turn on their cameras, we'd love to hear from you, and then I'll take some questions from the Q&A.
Can I start answering? Do you listen to me? I'm Andrea Oldani from Italy. So your question is about this canal. As this canal is a little different than historical canals all over the world because it's very recent. They started building this canal in 1954, so more or less 70 years ago, and is a very monofunctional. Is a diverse. It's for the diversion of the water exceeding some natural rivers. So it's a very technical infrastructure, and also for this reason. People doesn't have any connection with this canal. Actually, at the moment, this canal is basically also a little derelict because they are not doing maintenance, and the river banks are quite difficult to assess, and from the formal point of view is forbidden going around the canal because it's belonging to the country and is something like a military space. I don't know how to say in a different way. So basically, the engagement of the population is basically like zero. But the potential, I think, is related to the connection with important natural areas, reserve of diversity, and the possibility of using this space as a very strong connection between the dense city and the open space. That is something that can also change the idea itself of this infrastructure. It's quite curious also that there is there are some points where there is an intersection between these very technical infrastructure and the historical waterways that are now very active and livable public spaces because the water condition is very good and people likes to spend free time walking or biking along the waterways. This is something a bit different, for example, from what I saw in Bangkok, where sometimes those kind of waterways are very crowded and polluted, but for transportation and movement of goods. And yeah, let's say that in Italy now, the touristic use of waterways is something that is quite developed, especially around Milan, but the historical one, not the contemporary one.
Who would like to speak next?
I can talk to some of your questions about schools, if that's okay, and then I'll pass it to some of my colleagues to round out the conversation, perhaps. I think you've raised a couple of really interesting points. One, certainly the political context that we're working within here. And the interesting thing to note about American schools, however, is quite often decisions are made at municipal or local levels, versus perhaps some of the challenges we've seen at the federal level here. Certainly in sitting 13 blocks from the Capitol right now, I've certainly seen that in its many shapes and forms. So I think the good news to some extent is these decisions are made in a decentralized manner by generally political entities or governmental entities that haven't experienced quite the turmoil that the federal government has over time. That said, the federal government is moving now with the new administration towards an infrastructure bill, potentially, that might actually begin to impact some of the conversation that we're having, both about infrastructure affecting health and wellness, but the general state of repair of our schools that could potentially become influential. But your question about safety is one that, as an architect, we deal with every day as we're designing schools. And the issue of gun violence and active shooters is something that is actually one of the first questions that's raised oftentimes by school communities, certainly. And part of that is one of perception that, at least prior to the pandemic, there were a number of events, that put this front and center on everybody's minds. However, we just published a white paper on the idea of a more holistic view of safety and wellness in schools, which suggests that that may be front and center on everybody's minds, but actually there are other threats, that we need to be dealing with in schools, that are have a much greater impact on the general population. And I think that's part of what we're talking about today, and the idea of broadening the reach and the programs delivered by schools in many ways is targeted directly at safety in the broadest sense and the resilience of our communities, such that we're delivering services for food insecurity or mental and physical health and well-being that we've seen underscored throughout the population. So there are answers also about how a community can come into a building, and you don't have to allow necessarily access throughout the entirety of the building. It's just sort of good organization and appropriate entrances and appropriate supervision of that. So there are certainly architectural solutions to that. But Bruce, I'm curious if you have thoughts about, again, this larger idea of safety that we're positing through this community school idea.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to what Sean said, and that is we're working with a group called Safe and Sound Schools, and they have a lot of strategies that are relevant to this. I think Sean just hit it on the nail when he talked about the fact that the access issues can be addressed in ways that don't allow general access to all the different stakeholder groups that need to and should be using the schools. So I think that is something that's addressable. And the other point I would just add to respond to your very good questions, Michael, were that at the national level, I think we are going to see the US Department of Education have a lot more interest in pushing the idea of community schools to the localities, which Sean correctly pointed out are really the focal points. But what we're also seeing as recently as this morning, I got a email from a group that is pushing localities to learn how to use some of the COVID funding money to build out their community school functions in their schools. So it's penetrating down to the local levels as well. I think the viability is there.
Rebecca, do you have a comment?
I think they summarized that point really well, but happy to add on to other questions and let other people speak at this time.
Okay. Dr. Maciletto?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the interesting question. I see that the network is not really stable at the moment. Anyway, let me start from this dangerous question related to politics. So architecture, architecture cannot be disconnected from politics. I don't know the contrary. Sometimes politics is taking decision without consulting architecture or the architects or the urban planner. What is interesting in the case of Rwanda is the inclusivity, not only from our side, the academia. As you can see behind me, our School of Architecture, our brand new school. Of course, also the public and private sector and the inhabitants, the people that live Kigali, the Rwandans or the Kigalians. And so sure, an highlighted power or politics can lead in a good manner the development of the city, not only shaping the city through a master plan that unfortunately is reduced just to a technical tool, unfortunately. We are no more tout court, and this is not really interesting. And then going back also to your question about tropic architecture, I spent the last 10 years in Central Africa, and it has become my main topic for my. It's true, tropics in Ghana, which Ryan drew from England, develop for healthy issues in Africa. And so, sure, when we apply the principles or the details of the tropic architecture, we may respect and we may comply with some healthy issues that are here in the tropical region. The paper that I presented, try also to raise this problem of forgetting with the new project, the basic principle of tropical architecture, the distances between buildings, the cross ventilation, the orientation of the buildings, to comply also with the site, so the analysis, topographical analysis, and so on. And for example, these are all items that are all topics that we try to develop during the architectural studios with the students. The next generations of architects in Rwanda. So that's all. Maybe if you have other questions.
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have a question from the Q&A, actually keeping with the international nature of this event, a question from Israel that asks what the speakers of the conference think about the possibility to use the creative opportunity of building more social and cheap housing solutions, and for the maximal reuse or repurposing of commercial real estate. The questioner notes that the pandemic presents an opportunity to invest in the redevelopment of quality and effective public transport as well. So I guess this is a question towards the larger social possibilities presented by the current pandemic.
I can maybe start. I think what's interesting is that, I mean, as we kind of elucidated in our presentation, everything that's happened has really underpinned issues that were already existing for a long period of time. And it's really allowed us to think about our spaces and kind of everything. It's almost, I'm sure like many people who have watched The Crown recently, just getting into Winston Churchill again. But one of his, I think, amazing quotes is "Never waste a crisis." And I think from that, I think there's a lot we can learn, and especially about our environments. You know, with schools is one part of it, but our work environments, our residential sphere, everything is sort of, as we were articulating, is super interconnected. And I think it's allowed us to really see the domino effect with all our spaces as well. So I think with that in mind, if remote work is here to stay, let's say, what happens to that sphere of architecture within all these office buildings? Do they get resurfaced to serve other different needs and programmatic needs? There's also been a housing crisis for a long period of time. Do we also reevaluate our cities and infrastructure that's already been existing to really serve different needs accordingly as well? So I guess to answer the question, I feel, especially I think coming from the point of view of an architect, I think it's extremely interesting to examine all the major shifts that I think will occur of all of our spaces to accommodate kind of the shifting nature of everything that's happening to date, but also the shifting nature of that we're seeing the needs of our community as well.
We've got a question from a YouTuber. How do the presenters feel about hybrid indoor-outdoor environments? And especially as we're in this airborne pandemic, how do they work as a way to manage airflow in a sort of a passive manner.
I think it's a quite interesting and very complex question. I mean, I had one question also. There was also another question that I answered in the chat, going in the same direction, saying, but why thinking the use of some places as public spaces in time of crisis like this one, with problems of density and avoiding distancing, avoiding groups of people doing the same things in the same place. I think the problem of open air is something that, I mean, in the last years we lost the ability of recognizing the importance of open air spaces, going some time to spend our free time in shopping malls, gyms, and so on. For example, now something that here in Italy we are rediscovering is also the opportunity of doing some gym exercises inside of open public spaces. So some municipalities are trying to find some areas where to do gym, yoga, or other kind of activities, because it's much more easy to solve some problems in this kind of wide environments than inside of closed spaces. So for the same reason, I think in the future there will be new kind of architectural typologies where the role of open spaces will be much more important. I'm thinking to, for example, open air classes for the schools, but also open air gyms and, for example, open air ways of doing shopping like it was before the era of commercial mall, let's say. But this is little a personal opinion, and I think now it's too early for having a clear idea about what's is going to happen, because the situation is still going on and the complexity is increasing day by day, and our reaction is something that we cannot totally control. I mean, it's really something that is going on.
Yeah, and the open air hybrid space is really geographically dependent too. The possibilities in very temperate, high altitude Kigali is going to be dramatically different than Washington, D.C., which alternates based on my limited exposure between sweltering and freezing. Perhaps the American team could say a few words on possibilities for indoor-outdoor uses.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I would agree with some of the comments that it's a complex answer in many ways, and to your point that it depends on your location. However, there's actually a rich history of open air schools, in response to tuberculosis early in the 20th century, and renewed interest on some of the architecture of Duiker's fabulous open air school in the Netherlands, or Neutra's open air schools in California. So this idea of blurry boundaries between inside and out has been explored in the modern movement, but certainly we have much greater abilities to assess the performance of our buildings and the performance of the environment, and think about the integration of passive ventilation and other aspects of this question. That said, I think one of the positives coming out of the crisis is that even before the crisis, many of our buildings were sealed up tight. There were no operable windows. It was considered a detriment to the performance of the mechanical systems. And now we're realizing that operable windows, have an incredible value in some situations, to help enhance the ventilation in the environment. But that said, because we do work in a lot of locations, nationally and internationally, there are some urban settings where, frankly, the outdoor air is so polluted that it's unhealthy in many ways to either bring into the building, or in some situations even for the children to go out into the surrounding environment. So again, it's a contextual issue. It's based on climate, culture, the environment and the environmental controls, on auto vehicles and other emissions, that all becomes a very sort of complex calculus to answer your question. So.
Right, and as you mentioned in regards to urban pollution, where sites are situated within the city and issues around zoning and so forth. I think we have time for just one more question. It's a question that I need to plead ignorance about a specific term, but the Elisa Rice asks, how do you feel about 15-minute cities becoming more common in the US after the pandemic? I don't know what a 15-minute city is. This is a term widely used. Maybe it's a reference to urban revisioning in terms of being able to get to every part of the city within 15 minutes.
I'm assuming that's in reference to walkability, but I could be mistaken. If that's the question, I hope that this is
I think it's
useful.
about walkability. It's something that I heard also in Europe, but since the question is about US, better answering someone from US.
I think there will be, I think similarly to everything that's happening, just a heightened awareness of our surrounding communities and what's there, especially now if you're with kind of in a block radius, and if you don't have a grocery store, if you don't have a school nearby, it's sort of really heightening kind of the needs of your everyday life to be in a small radius, I think, if it is such an emphasis on walkability. I think also what's interesting now with as people are being more inwards, they're more focused on who their neighbors are, what's in the surrounding, are they able to kind of have everything they need in a short distance, and less reliability, I would say, on other forms of transit, from car to this, from train, plane, what have you. And I think with that, there'll be an increased focus on what makes, I think, an idealized community, as opposed to saying there's maybe 4 major centers within a city, and I think more kind of a more hub and spoke model, that there'll be more kind of micro amenities within all of our communities and maybe going to a larger hub. So I would say, yes, I think there will be a much larger transition. And I think that was already in the works, I think, for a long time within the United States, but also in other parts of the world as well.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Don't mean to cut you off, but we're out of time. And I love ending this session on an optimistic note for a better city. So thank you to the presenters so much. Thank you to the attendees, and thank you to the organizers, Caitlin and Mohammed. I pass the microphone back to Mohammed.
Thank you, Mike. Our third and final session of today is entitled Education and Pedagogy. As noted in the session on ecology, one hard-hit institution in the era of COVID were schools. To maintain social distancing and reduce the spread of COVID-19, schools from elementary to higher education closed and or shifted almost overnight to remote instruction. Although online learning is nothing new, this sudden and nearly universal shift to remote learning required wholesale rethinking of pedagogical norms, and in so doing put issues of equity and access into stark relief, and changed the experience and delivery of both teaching and learning, while introducing new opportunities for collaboration. The presentations today will share stories of innovation and also offer cautionary tales about long-term impacts on educational outcomes, as inequities, accessibility, lack of adequate resources, and significant stressors enter the at-home or eventually in-person classrooms. These questions in mind, papers in this category will explore the impact of pandemics on higher education, especially in the fields related to the built environment, how the pandemic has affected architecture and urban design curriculum in the short and long terms, both opportunities and challenges of remote teaching in the COVID era, and the ways in which COVID-19 has impacted the educational experience for students. likely parts of online teaching practices will remain with us in ways good and challenging into the future. The presentations in this session urge us to consider how this technological shift might be leveraged toward greater equity, accessibility, and in the case of architectural design studios, the focus of this session leveraged to envision meaningful design interventions for a post-COVID world. Dr. Ashraf Salama will be moderating this session. Dr. Salama is Professor of Architecture and Director of Research at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. He has led 3 schools of architecture in Egypt, Qatar, and the United Kingdom, 2 of which he has founded. Having authored and co-edited 14 books and published over 170 articles and chapters in the International Refereed Press, he is the chief editor of ArcNet IJAR and co-chief editor of Open House International. Professor Salama is the recipient of the 2017 UIA Schumi Prize for Excellence in Architectural Education and Criticism.
Thank you very much, Mohammed and Kathleen, for this important event and this introduction. Its diversity and plurality, and for really the excellent design and planning of the topics and the sessions. In this session on pedagogy, we have 5 contributions from 4 countries: United States, Philippines, Serbia, and United Arab Emirates, addressing pedagogy on pedagogical issues that have universal applicability in the context of this pandemic, in architecture planning and interior design, and really addressing timely and critical issues relevant to education of future built environment professionals. The first presentation is in the context of the Great Plains in America, and it's by Bud Schoenfeld, who's an assistant professor of architecture, and the Mel Trula Bachman Professor in Healthcare Design at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He received his Master of Architecture degree from Louisiana State University, and his research is focused on healthy placemaking for rural resilience, as well as the study and practice of beginning design pedagogy.
Teaching a beginning design studio to students for 8 weeks over the summer has its challenges in a typical year. I'm here today to discuss an atypical year, one full of unimaginable challenges, but one that I will argue opens new opportunities for equitable design education in rural and frontier locations. Nebraska's capital city, Lincoln, is not considered rural by most measures. However, the students that attend the University of Nebraska are often from rural and frontier communities across the Great Plains. The challenges and pedagogical adaptations required to successfully teach a summer design studio during COVID-19 isolation provides a post-COVID model for education equity in rural and frontier communities. The focus of the design studio is on making within the design process as a means of developing ideas, with concentrated learning outcomes on physical and digital modeling, freehand drawing, orthographic projection, and other forms of graphic representation. I would like to add that the successful outcomes of this studio were made possible through a collaboration with UNL instructor Nolan Golgert and graduate teaching assistant Ashley Glessinger. With 1/3 of our students being from rural communities, it was important to adapt the studio expectations to the realities of rural isolation. For students in remote locations, obtaining art supplies for a project might require driving to a store an hour and a half to 2 hours away. Additionally, the project expectations had to be mindful of the new working conditions facing the students. Students might be working at a dining room table or on the floor or even in a room with a sick parent. The approach was to start the semester with materials that could be acquired from any location. For example, graphic packaging, cardboard, colored cardstock, etc. It was also important to scale back the size of the project deliverables to accommodate constrained working conditions. Additionally, an undergraduate assistant helped develop a series of videos the students could reference as needed. In the Toolbox video, she shares common design studio tools, how to use them, and alternative options that might be more cost-effective or more easily attainable in rural locations. For students, the design studio is where work is shared with peers and instructors, and new ideas are developed and evaluated. The design studio is the cornerstone of design education. As an alternative to the studio, we explored different online options, but in the end, the best solution was one that all students were familiar and comfortable with: social media. This platform was used by the studio to share and critique proposed solutions to design problems. It required that students not only post images to Instagram, but also share their intent by writing short summaries of the work, developing a skill atypical to design studios. Another advantageous outcome of the Instagram platform was anonymity. We all shared and posted work to the studio account, which required one name and one password. Project postings were not linked to student names. This allowed the class to have in-depth conversations on the merit of the work itself without any associations to its creator. Additionally, by grading the work prior to our studio conversations, the students were guaranteed a fair and unbiased evaluation of the proposed solution to the design project. Lastly, Instagram became a very useful tool for discussing and evaluating the successes or shortcomings of a given solution. In this example, we use Zoom tools to identify primary and secondary compositional elements from the students' selected artwork. And then, by taking advantage of Instagram's platform, which stacks images sequentially, we are able to discuss the successes or shortcomings of that student's compositional response to the image. So here you see lines being overlaid on a selected image by the student. And then we're able to take that and overlay it on top of the compositions that were put together by the student to evaluate shortcomings as well as successes within those compositions. The final project of the summer studio is to propose a design intervention on an actual site in Lincoln. Rather than let COVID-19 deprive the students of this design opportunity, several instructors worked with the director of photography for university communications to use drone technology to capture the site. As a result of not having to photograph and visit the entire site, the students spent more time on research rather than assuming they knew the place by visiting it. This also allowed all students equal access to the assigned site. Expanding the experience. The impact of COVID-19 forced design instructors to reevaluate how a design studio could be taught online, but it also provided a unique opportunity to rethink how a beginning design studio should be taught. The studio is no longer confined to a physical space. Expanding the experience engages the students and exposes the beginning design student to experiences outside of preconceived expectations. COVID isolation expanded our access to opportunities and information that was previously outside of our reach, especially in rural America. For example, the Friday before classes started, I invited my students to join me in Los Angeles for a lecture by the prominent architect and educator Mark Foster Gage. This was obviously done virtually and not in person. Also, in an effort to fight Zoom fatigue and at the same time expand the studio experience, we started the mornings with music and analysis and complemented the mid-morning discussions with relevant short films or performances. Lastly, and one of my favorite outcomes of COVID-19 is trading time with fellow design educators at other institutions, nationally or internationally, and exposing students to diverse design perspectives and methodological approaches. I wanted to end with this slide. Behind each of these backgrounds is a student. What you see is their proposal for a given project. In this environment, we work very hard. We provide each other critical feedback, and the success of the individual students relies on the contributions of everyone involved. Educational equity suggests unimpeded access to education and the removal of barriers standing in the way of student success. The Summer Studio's response to COVID-19 was to focus on equity of education, include students in the process, and approach the challenge as a design problem. The outcomes of this studio reflect not only a successful response to the pandemic, but provides a framework for equitable design education. Thank you for your time.
Okay, and the second presentation in the context of the Philippines and with a collaborator from Australia too, we have a number of co-presenters and contributors for this presentation about implications for place-making pedagogy. Richard Caraga is an assistant professor of management at the University of the Philippines, Visayas, at Tacloban City, Philippines. Shirley Maraya is a faculty member in the Division of Management at the University of the Philippines, Visayas also. Maria Sescan is a management faculty at the University of the Philippines, Visayas. And we have also Dr. Adelina Mateo Babiano, is a senior lecturer in urban planning at the University of Melbourne, and she's part of the award-winning Place agency. So please start.
In this presentation, we used the implementation of the placemaking course as a case study to explore the impact of the pandemic on remote teaching and how it has impacted the educational experience of professional development students in the Philippines. The Philippines is an archipelagic country with 7,107 islands. One of its administrative regions is the Eastern Visayas, which consists of 6 provinces, 1 independent city, and 1 highly urbanized city, its capital, Tacloban City. As of 2015, it has a population of 4.4 million. To respond to the paucity of learning opportunities in urban planning, the first ever professional development training course on public space management aimed to teach placemaking theory and practice was implemented by University of the Philippines Academics, inspired by the placemaking sandbox project of the Place Agency. This teaching pedagogy included the hosting of a 24-hour synchronous lectures and focus group discussions done in 8 sessions, provision of a learning management system that was made available for 45 days where uploaded learning resources and materials can be accessed anytime. Discussion fora were set up to facilitate interaction, journal reflections, and case studies as assessment tools were rolled out. This made the 40 participants spread throughout the islands of Leyte and Samar participate remotely and safely at the convenience of their home or local workspaces, and also address the varied and individual gadget and internet connectivity challenges, still gaining the professional education and learnings at par to the traditional face-to-face training setup.
Student respondents were asked to define placemaking and the purpose of placemaking using the 5P, people, process, product, program, and place evaluation placemaking framework as a tool to analyze the responses. Pre-survey results revealed that students perceive placemaking as focusing mostly on the product aspect of placemaking. The first word cloud shows that placemaking is mostly understood in the context of a physically built environment, development interventions in spatial in nature, tangible and visible infrastructures. The second word cloud shows its purpose as a process of creating better public spaces. As one respondent states, it is the shaping of underutilized spaces to be more usable, livable, and beautiful. There is a bias towards addressing and satisfying the immediate needs of the people and the community, and mostly mixed up with ideas of place masking and place washing. Placemaking is understood as creating places that are not only aimed at social and human development, but also the natural environment. We all know that connection to our ecosystems, the trees, animals, wind, water, and sun is critical to our well-being.
To evaluate their learning, students were asked to self-report on their growth based on the head, heart, and hand pedagogical model. The Triple H model represents a way to simultaneously engage our cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains of learning to achieve a holistic education. While this model has been successfully applied to topics such as eco-literacy and sustainability through the Placemaking Sandbox project, this has been used to evaluate pedagogical approach to placemaking in tertiary institutions. The post survey showed students self-reporting an increased understanding of the 5P, while also confirmed a high level of head, heart, hand dimensions of transformative learning through the online delivery, with average responses as head 6.5 out of the highest possible value of 7, heart 6.39, and hand 6.17. The low rating in the hand dimension validates the effect of non-face-to-face or online delivery. Hence, while the pandemic restricted teaching and learning activities that would elicit better student learning outcomes if face-to-face meetings, hands-on training, and community engagement were made possible, it also opened opportunities to test alternative curriculum design and online delivery platforms, enabling empirical observations and the collection of pre- and post-student perception surveys of their learnings.
So the key challenge of the placemaking training program was delivering an alternative online subject delivery format for a place-based subject purposely designed for face-to-face. Whilst internet connectivity was an issue experienced by some participants, limiting their participation in the twice weekly synchronous meetings, participants still valued their overall learning. Although physical meetings did not happen, the online Zoom platform still allowed the creation of a digital community of learners with a common goal of advancing their built environment knowledge, demonstrating that it is still possible to create a community of learners, whether online or face-to-face. Participants self-reported overall growth in placemaking knowledge and skills. The Triple H results showed different knowledge and skills were enhanced, slightly higher on heart and head skills, and slightly lower on the hand or practical skills. Participants initially understood placemaking based on its physical dimension, but in the end, they understood its multidimensionality. In summary, they understood that the purpose of placemaking is about creating meaningful relationships. Thank you.
In this
Okay, we have the following presentation, which is really very interesting, and it takes us from the context of the Philippines to the West Balkan countries and the University of Belgrade, Serbia. So our contributors are diverse in this one, and there are 9 people, 9 architects, practicing architects and researchers. The presentation will be presented by Milos Kostic, but a brief collective biography here that the work is based on the experiences of the group of 9 teaching and research assistants who initiated an organized online workshop during the COVID-19 pandemic last April at the University of Belgrade Faculty of Architecture. They are engaged in working in 3 different departments at the Faculty of Architecture. And these departments are architecture, urbanism, and architecture technology. And they gathered professionally for the purpose of this initiative, the workshop.
Good afternoon. My name is Milos Kostic, and it is my pleasure to present you the research entitled An Online Student Workshop as a Pedagogical Experiment Necessitated by COVID-19 in Serbia. The presentation will showcase a pedagogical experiment conducted in the form of an extracurricular student online workshop, COVID-19 Challenges, Architecture of Pandemic, organized during the pandemic lockdown in April 2020 by the University of Belgrade Faculty of Architecture, Serbia. The research is based on the experiences of 9 teaching and research assistants aged from 27 to 35 years, who initiated an organized online workshop. They were employed in 3 different departments: architecture, urbanism, and architectural technology, and they gathered professionally for the purpose of this initiative. Throughout history, the global society faced various crises which had negative consequences for society. However, the specificity of the current COVID-19 crisis is manifested in a much shorter time frame, which makes the consequences immediately visible. Therefore, a rapid response regarding professional action is needed to reduce the risk of spreading the virus. On the other hand, such specific crises, which can often be unpredictable, show an adequate spatial programming framework for the prevention and suppression of the pandemic spread or mitigation of its consequences. Additionally, living and studying in a time of pandemics created a situation in which students are both witnesses and agents of change. This situation emphasized the need to make a greater effort in order to cope with the given challenges in a sustainable manner. The cause for workshop initiation was found in professional responsibility, intention to contribute to the overall critical debate on how cities should function, and the will to continue the faculty endeavor to provide a range of extracurricular activities due to recognized importance in architectural education. The online workshop was organized in April 2020. During this time, Serbia was in complete lockdown, transferring all teaching activities to online learning environment. The workshop was focused on the search for new, innovative typologies and architectural scenarios that will enable the daily activities to be carried out safely and effectively, even in the time of pandemic. The workshop was organized into 4 phases. The initial phase was held as an introductory presentation in which tutors presented the topic and expected workshop results. In the second phase, students presented the initial scope of an action through Pecha presentations. Based on the complementarity of certain aspects, the spatial level of activity, and the programmatic orientation, the students were divided into 6 thematic fields within which further work continued. The main focus of the third and the most dynamic phase was the development of conceptual designs and studies through open discussions between students, tutors, and critics in all 6 thematic frameworks. Each day was divided into 2 sessions. In the first session, 3 tutors were assigned to work with students according to the thematic frameworks. The second session consisted of an overview of students' work at the given moment, followed by a discussion with critics. During the fourth phase, students worked independently to finalize their conceptual designs based on feedback from the daily reviews, and in following days, the tutors prepared a bilingual ebook in which the research perspectives, thematic frameworks, student works, comments, and reflections of the critics were explained. In order to present results of the workshop to the wider community, an online exhibition was organized. In workshop assessment and dissemination phase of the research, the results of the workshop were systematized in the form of 29 design proposals grouped into 6 thematic frameworks. The first one was improvement of functional performance of space, aimed to explore the opportunities for enhancing communication, establishing safe spatial distances, and to improve delivery and transportation mechanisms. This framework also included critical thinking of the modules and standards in housing design. The second one is alternative modes of space use. The thematic framework represented rethinking and reorganizing of spaces of collective everyday activities and gatherings, such as trade facilities and open market systems, and reuse of distinct open public spaces in the time of emergency. Urban equipment and public spaces. Projects within this framework suggested mapping and adapting underused spaces for the better quality of leisure activities, outdoor work, living space, as well as rethinking the design of open public space and its elements concerning security barriers. The fourth one, design of protective equipment, prototypes, consisted of ideas that are primarily related to the creation of prototypes and patents of protective gear that can be used during the pandemic. That included the design of different spatial barriers, protective masks, pneumatic structures used for protection purposes, but also the design of different everyday things that can be carried as corona kit or disinfection equipment. The next one is altered everyday life, proposing ideas of reconsidering relations between outdoor and indoor spaces within spatial restrictions caused by the pandemic situation and the establishment of new normality. The designs explore the possibilities of supplementing everyday living spaces and functions with elements of nature, open space, or space for hobbies. The final framework deals with accommodation models for the most vulnerable groups and consists of projects that explore possibilities of improving the space for the most endangered groups of people, elderly and infected. and finding new spatial capacities for accommodation within both urban and rural environment. The later implication can be recognized on two levels. The first level is reflected in the professional contribution in the architecture of pandemics. It encouraged and empowered students to seek the answers to COVID-19 challenges, both in process and problem-oriented manner. The disciplinary framework of architecture and urbanism was once again illuminated as a symbiosis of technical, technological, and socio-humanistic and artistic aspects. The second level of contribution is reflected in developing new methodological framework of online learning applicable to various teaching and extracurricular activities in the future. Based on our results, future research should focus on enabling active experimentation in times of pandemics, thus closing the cycle of experiential learning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we have now our first presentation, which is in the context of Sharjah, United Arab Emirates, and it outlines a pedagogical experience in response to the COVID-19 as a teaching experiment and as well as a survey that tries to measure student reactions to that experiment. So we have two contributors to this work. Dr. Ahmed Sukkar is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Sharjah, United Arab Emirates, currently shortlisted for the Mohammed Makaya Prize, Middle Eastern Architecture Personality of the Year. He completed his PhD in Architecture Humanities from the University of London and was a scholar in a number of universities and visiting fellow in MIT and Cambridge and Oxford University. And we have Dr. Ahmad Mushtaha, who is an associate professor at the University of Sharjah. He obtained his PhD in the field of urban and environmental engineering from Hokkaido University, Japan, and published more than 40 articles in architecture and urban management, housing, sustainability. He is an active research member in the Sustainable Engineering Asset Management research group at the University of Sharjah.
Our ongoing research attempts to resituate the current debate between architectural educators around the world, including the Arab region, who see the challenge of remote teaching in the COVID era as opportunities to check the sacredness of traditional design studio culture, and other architectural educators who fear that this challenge could eliminate this culture in the long term. Exploring theoretical and practical aspects of these opportunities and the challenges of remote teaching during the pandemic, it examines how COVID-19 has impacted the learning experience of architectural students and the teaching practice of their instructors at the University of Sharjah, United Arab Emirates. The case study focuses on architectural design studio of 16 students at the Architectural Engineering Department, shared between two PhD holder instructors supervising fourth-year students groups during fall 2020 in one of 5 studios, each being shared between 2 instructors. The 2 instructors, who have distinct theoretical and practical background, also teach theoretical courses and serve on final juries at other colleges and universities in the Arab region. The students have worked simultaneously for 2 submissions, one to the department and the other to a competition entitled Haptic, organized by the world's leading platform for global architectural competitions, UNI. Paradoxically, at the time when touching is discouraged, the design brief has focused on tactile and materiality in architecture as elements of construction and aesthetics to design a museum of material in a site in Barcelona, Spain. The virtual design teaching was conducted using MS Teams. The virtual teaching included online digital sketching on digital models placed on Google Maps with extensive references to examples of projects on the internet. We have conducted a questionnaire of 50 questions divided into 3 sections to survey the perspectives of our students about online teaching and learning. The first section focuses on their current view on key parameters of the impact of online education on studio teaching and learning. The second section focuses on their futuristic perspectives on the same parameters. The third section includes a concluding statement and an open question. The parameters were communication, motivation, creativity, productivity, learning experience, effectiveness of time, flexibility, and well-being and health. The findings about Teaching Studio in the COVID-19 age include the following summary. The student rank communication, creativity, productivity, learning experience, and the effectiveness of time and flexibility positively. They rank well-being and health negatively. Their futuristic perspectives on the same parameters match their current view. Most students agreed that design studio culture has changed form, but has neither been lost nor been shaken. Online teaching became less challenging throughout the course. The students are divided almost equally in their preference for hybrid teaching. Most students think that online teaching will not undermine the roles of instructors in the learning process in the long term. Thank you.
Our final presentation in this session basically addresses interior design in the context of California State University, Northridge, and in an interior design program, and try to look at the effectiveness of virtual learning in the context of the pandemic. We have 2 contributors. Hussam Gamari is an assistant professor in the interior design program at the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences, California State University, Northridge. He has an over 10 years experience in research, practice, and teaching in interior design and architecture. He obtained his PhD with a focus on wayfinding in unfamiliar environments. We have Nasreen Golshani, second contributor, is a PhD student at the Department of Architecture, University of Oregon. She also serves as a graduate researcher at the High Performance Environments Lab. Her research work focuses on understanding the relationship between the built environment and health outcomes.
Good morning. I would like to thank the Epidemic Urbanism Symposium to provide this opportunity to present the findings of this study on investigating the effectiveness of virtual learning in design studios in Los Angeles, United States. So this study focuses on interior design studios as places that interior design students have interactions with each other and with their instructors to learn their design projects. Students spend hours of time to develop their design ideas and present those ideas. As we know, COVID-19 has significantly impacted learning, and particularly it has been severe changes in design studios, and that has generated serious problems and challenges for those students. So in this study, we are curious to know what changes have been done, and what are the positive and negative outcomes of virtual learning in design studios. The objective of this study was to identify the major challenges of architecture and design education in pandemic world and assess the degree to which virtual teaching platforms have been effective to address those challenges. For this study, we used online survey and interview with the students and their instructors, and we had 47 undergraduate interior design students participated in the online survey as well as the interviews. And all the students were freshmen that they were working on designing an educational facility for their project. After collecting the data, we conducted content analysis for the interviews. And the data has been mainly collected from California State University from interior design studios. And since this is an ongoing research project, and we are in the process of analyzing the data, we would be delighted to share the findings of this study in future. But for today, I'm going to focus on some main aspects of the findings of this study. So the results of this study show that there is a significant negative impact of virtual learning on collaboration and communication between the students and their instructors. So the results and responses from students indicated that collaboration has been negatively impacted due to the restrictions that the students found in virtual learning. And also there is less communication between students in the virtual classrooms for design studios. Also, we focused on the design process and its component as part of the learning outcome of these classrooms. So what we found was model making as one of the major components for freshman students to experiment different forms and learn craftsmanship has been negatively impacted as well. And the reason is there is less time and control on having demonstration in virtual classroom for making and construction. Also, site visit of the project is an important and essential component of the design process for interior design students, and that has been also significantly restricted in virtual learning. Interestingly, we found that the students showed more satisfaction in virtual learning of these design studios compared to in-person meetings. And the findings show that the students were more satisfied because they found more time and more engagement with their instructors to share their projects and ask for feedback. Also, in terms of pinup and presentation, what we found was the students were more satisfied and they preferred virtual learning over in person. And that's an interesting finding as well, because the findings showed that the students were more engaged and they were delighted to see other students' projects at the same time in virtual platforms. Overall, we found that learning outcome has been impacted and there are positive and negative points that should be investigated and addressed to make the virtual learning more effective and efficient. To conclude, this study focused on interior design studios and positive and negative impacts of COVID-19. There are four major areas that this study touched on that can be used to provide implications and recommendations for future studies, as well as finding teaching strategies in virtual classrooms. The first one is about global approach and design pedagogy. So what we found in this study was students were more satisfied with virtual learning because instructors, they had a global approach and they invited instructors all around the world to be part of the pinup and critic. And that can be used as one of the strategies to help the students to receive feedback and basically review their projects from multiple perspectives. And that can be followed by multidisciplinary critic and mentorship. And for interior design students, that's an important part of their learning to have a multidisciplinary critic and mentorship for their project. So virtual learning can involve people from other disciplines, as virtual platforms can help them to communicate better within the design studios. Also, what we found was, as I mentioned earlier, engaging students and collaborating between students has been a major challenge in virtual classrooms. So instructors and people involved in design studios are encouraged to use innovative pedagogical strategies to engage students in virtual classrooms. In addition to that, we would like to encourage instructors to focus more on making and demonstrations in the classroom, as that has been significantly restricted by virtual learning in design studios. Thank you very much for paying attention to this presentation.
Thank you very much. I would say I just want to start by thanking all the presenters for, number one, their commitment to shape and rethink their practices in the context of this condition, to the delivery experiences they have gone through, and to reflect on the implications of the situation we find ourselves in. And of course, on their students' responses. I have a couple of comments first, and then we'll see the course of the event of the rest of the remaining 15 minutes. The presentations collectively demonstrate two important things. Architecture education is passing through or experiencing a transitional emergency model that demonstrates the adaptation, mitigation to cope with this unprecedented situation, and potentially this may result in entirely reshaping a model that we have experienced for 200 years, that was a dominant model for 200 years. The presentations also demonstrate a fascinating range of initiatives, and collectively they teach us and tell us much in terms of the reimagining of architecture pedagogy and the integration of and mainstreaming of technology. They manifest an opportunity to bring research on pedagogy, normally occupying a marginalized position within academia, to the forefront of discussions on architecture education and the education of future architects. There is a couple of questions here, and let me start by, there was one question from a previous session, and that's important, and it's for all the contributors here. And I would say it's about digital platforms and how digital platforms are generic, and do we, whether we need to have a custom-based digital platform for teaching design and teaching architecture design, interior design, design of all forms. So I would really open this for discussion to the presenters, and perhaps we can start by Bud, the first presenter, if possible.
Yes, that's a great question. I think, as you saw in my presentation, I guess I would challenge some of that notion, because for me, I found that the students wanted to be in a platform that they were comfortable with. And so it was really about trying to adapt platforms that they were used to in ways that could be innovative in new ways. And even, and maybe this is going off a little bit from the question, but for me, like, so I taught beginning design students. Most of my students were 19, 20 years old, and they had no real kind of studio experience, which was another reason for introducing using the tools that they were familiar with. But the complaints came that, what about the studio experience? Like, what about like getting together in a classroom and everything else? And so I practiced for 15 years, actually longer than that, probably 17 to 18 years before I started teaching. And I told them that my first 5 years, I never visited the site that I was designing projects for. Now, we could argue that isn't a good idea, but it's the reality of the industry. So being able to kind of adapt to platforms that are already there and that are familiar with people across continents and everything else, I think that's important. So I would although I think it's interesting, I would say that there's a lot of value in kind of being innovative with the tools that people are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Comments from other colleagues who have experimented really with digital platforms and found difficulties basically in adapting these platforms. So maybe the presentation from Sharjah, Ahmed, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Salama, for the very good question, because actually this is at the heart of the problem, at least in our studio, that, for example, students in the past used to work together in the same space, sometimes on the same computer, or at least to pass files between each other easily, or at least be in the same, using the same Wi-Fi. So they were able actually to work together, but because of them working far from each other in different cities and even in different countries, so they were not able to work together on the same models. And many of them, I would not say complaining, but kind of expressing ideas or expressing their feeling that what they, in the past, what they have used to do in like 2 hours, they now need 6 hours to complete. And this is one of the main challenges of technology. I think over time it would be resolved by through the BIM technology and developing such kind of things. But I mean, having said all of that, I think that it has many advantages that we know in architecture challenges sometimes create or open doors for creativity. I can talk a lot about that, but I guess this is a summary of the situation.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Milos, also from the perspective of Belgrade, I'm familiar with the school and the activities of the school and visited your school a couple of times. So it would be good to get your insight on the digital platform adaptation or custom-based one, please.
Yes, thank you first for the great symposium and for discussing all these interesting topics. I would like to add to these previous points that, for example, I think that this type of rigid structures that were bound to these traditional pedagogy models were not, has shown during this pandemic to not be very appropriate for transferring them one-to-one into a digital environment. Because of it, these new platforms such as Zoom platform or Microsoft Teams offered constant development of the new tools and new plugins, which enabled us to work with different groups of students from different levels, which are located in different countries, as already mentioned, or in different cities at the same time. And challenging these traditional models of design studios, which are usually organized in one space where the groups are divided and people need to work among themselves and to find the solutions. These new platforms enabled creation of different rooms and different virtual spaces, like separate classrooms, which enabled continual work with tutors, with mentors, with critics. That was very useful for organizing a workshop that we were talking about today, because we had, for example, a large number of students. It was almost 100 students working at the same time with a small group of mentors, and this enabled different transitions between these chat rooms and between these digital classrooms, which gave a huge contribution to each project.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to other questions, and also other speakers would have an opportunity to respond to. There is a question about the impact of COVID-19 on the production of knowledge and the attitude of the students on the group work. It's basically double questions about the production of knowledge, one, and about the impact on the idea of group work. So probably the speakers, the team from the Philippines would give us, because basically it's beyond the typical or the mainstream studio work, the class you are teaching, which is interesting. So it would be good to hear your perspective also.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions and also for the opportunity to be here. So I'm Durley. And yeah, so for the question in terms of production of knowledge, I think it was interesting that we had the framework or the tool to self-report on, you know, the knowledge gained as well as the skills gained, right? So from that framework, we saw that there has been more focus on the development on the critical thinking side, the head side, as well as the heart side, rather than the hand side, right? So I think it does demonstrate that through the, you know, online learning, there are areas that actually is enhanced better than the other areas, right? So that was one of the, I guess, the outcome of moving towards online platform. And and that's, you know, answering the first question, the production of knowledge. And I think in terms of the challenges that that we found, I think it's more of challenges both for the students as well as for the academics, right, for the teachers. So in terms of the challenges, I think it was more on the online connection, as well as the time difference, I guess, because I mean, there is a 3-hour difference, and managing that time difference was really a challenge, I think, for most of us. You know, like now I'm in Australia and it's 5 in the morning. So it's a bit challenging, right? But anyway, I think what we learned really was while we moved into asynchronous, so meaning we were trying to pre-record and show, and this is talking about the situation here in Australia where we were told by the administration to record our, you know, webinars and teaching, and we did that. Then it was shown to students, but we saw that the students really craved for, you know, synchronous socialization with their groups. And I think having that breakout rooms were really useful in the Zoom platform. But at the same time, secondly, was the collaborative platform that we use, like Mural, were really useful in order to kind of simulate that face-to-face workshop style in one room, in one table, moving into, you know, online space. And so I think, in summary, I guess the lessons that we learned is that we were, in a way, became more experimental. We became more resilient and I think agile to kind of suit the change that were required by the situation. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. We have another question also. Actually, it's a complex one, but just to simplify it, it is about the idea of hybrid learning. So most of us now are talking either or. It's physical or virtual. What about hybrid learning, and whether we're going to experience new types of physical spaces, maybe smaller than the existing ones? What's going to take place in terms of, if you could like speculate? And I would say this is to Hassam, so because he's an interior designer, so give us a little more on this, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Salam, for coordinating this session. It has been a pleasure to being among all these great educators. That's a great question, I think. And first of all, I would like to say I'm so optimistic about the future, because to me, we are learning our lessons from virtual learning, and we are learning ways that we can incorporate those lessons in the future, hopefully in physical environment. So the study that we conducted actually found that there are pros and cons for virtual learning. So that shows that there are lessons that we can learn from virtual learning. And I think definitely hybrid learning can be a solution for the future. So basically looking at the subject matter from different perspectives, like in architecture and interior design education, we have lecture courses versus activity-based courses or studios. So they require different approach for teaching. So virtual learning might be a good solution, and more to our virtual learning we can incorporate in lecture classes, but definitely studio classes require more attention. And even within the studio classes, we have to be very careful about what level of students we are talking about. Like
from my personal experience, upper division studios, they require different basically attentions for their studios, and lower division students also, they have their own requirements. So one thing that I've noticed in my classes is, for instance, physical models and demonstration, it's a big challenge in lower division studios because to me, there's no practical way to teach physical modeling in virtual learning, and it requires in-person meetings and interactions with the students. So that has been a big challenge for lower division, which I believe in the future there should be more innovative ways if we were to do virtual learning for that. But overall, I think these lessons will help us in the future, and hybrid learning definitely can help us to teach efficiently and more effectively in different levels of students for interior design and architecture.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. There is one more question, and actually it's an open-ended discussion about the idea of mental health. We already know that there were many statistics before the pandemic that, especially in architecture and allied design disciplines, there is a mental health issue, and many students are experiencing basically mental breakdowns, and in the context of Europe as well as in other contexts. So what do you think the implication of the COVID and the condition it has created? I think we're not talking enough about mental health, but I would leave it to you also to tell us a little bit more if you feel we need to conduct research on mental health, or what was the mental health aspects related to your research. Okay, Ahmad, please. No, we can't hear you.
Sorry for that. This is the heart of our presentation and our interest, and I hope I will say something and probably Dr. Imad would add to it. In the survey that we have conducted, we had like 8 parameters about creativity, motivation, all kinds of things that have been discussed in this session about like production of knowledge, being creative, and so on. The final one was about well-being and health, and students more or less were really very positive about everything. And I believe that online education, all in all, has improved the process a lot. I mean, it has some disadvantage, but it has so many advantages. Except the well-being and health, they felt isolated. They felt they had like kind of psychological issues. They felt that they can't stay like that for so long. They felt that there are too much things to arrange. They have to go to Blackboard and online and watch it and keep watching it minute by minute and so on. And then the technical issues of each one in different countries. So they were not really satisfied with just in terms of the well-being and health. And this is beyond the control of us, the instructors. So in this semester, we have tried to develop ways to respond to that. For example, to increase visual communication. For me, in my classes, I urge students to turn on their videos. I didn't used to really stress this issue in the last semester. All to somehow bring students to some feeling of having like a physical environment. And I hope software can develop themselves in this direction. I mean, some softwares are not really designed to take care of this issue.
There is one more thing I just want to say, especially because in the case of Hussam and Bud, about first-year students and beginning students. So those are type of students that you haven't seen before. And then the pandemic happened. And then what do? It's like there is no prior experience with these students. I noticed that in the presentation of Bud, he talked about, softening the atmosphere through music, performances, and multiple learning opportunities, and these are excellent. But I was wondering if there are other mechanisms that we can utilize to reduce the level of anxiety and all of these issues.
So I'll just add one thing to that. I found that this issue of mental health, a lot of the students, like, I noticed it even before we got into online learning and everything else, just because it's such a taxing and difficult profession. But what I found was that a lot of the students, and maybe it was, we would have one-on-one meetings, which are really hard to have in the studio and physical studio, where they can really kind of open up to, to me, or, express how they're feeling. I found that actually most of my students were more comfortable talking with me online than not. And then the other thing I would add to Ahmad's comment, having everyone had to have their screen on, it helped the students see that, hey, someone else doesn't get it either, or someone else looks like they're about to fall asleep or cry or whatever. And I think that's really important. So they knew that they weren't alone in this, that other people are feeling the same way they are.
I would like to add a comment as well,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. So one thing that actually I've noticed about the students is they keep asking themselves these questions that, why do I study? Like, what's the future for me? And so one thing about their future, as they are concerned, because of the pandemic and the impact that it had on their job market, I think just being honest with the students and explaining the situation, because like the job market before the pandemic, at least in the United States, was pretty good, and it got impacted, and now we are not certain about the future, but just being honest with them about what are the opportunities for the future, and not basically stopping their effort, but putting more effort to be successful in the future. So that's one thing that I would like to highlight. And also one other thing that I noticed regarding mental health, since I'm teaching interior design studios, we know that physical environment has impact on their health. So I think these days, in this pandemic era, we are seeing more attention to physical environment to make that impact, and just like highlighting the importance and informing students that there are more attentions toward physical environment. I think that make them even feel better about what they do in their major.
Very good. Edelina, please, one final comment from you.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. So that's really a good question, because what we found with our students is that there really was heightened emotions in terms of, what happened last year, wherein we were in hard lockdown in Melbourne. So a lot of reactions where they were really, asking questions, demanding so much from us academics. But at the same time, we also have safeguards, I guess, to support them. So I think one of the things that really helped was creating a community of, like through WhatsApp. So through WhatsApp, a community of students wherein they kind of shared their thoughts, ideas, or activities, etc. Another thing was having virtual coffee, book club, writing sessions that really were more of a social kind of gathering, but virtually. And I think what else? So there was also from the university a team mentoring process wherein 2 academics were meeting with 4 undergrad students, and these are mainly targeted for those new students coming in who had never had the opportunity to meet anyone else in person. So I think these were the strategies that were put in place to kind of address the issue of lack of socialization and COVID restrictions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Please, Kathleen, thank you. Thanks to everyone for the wonderful session.
Thank you so much. We unfortunately have come to the end of our time together today. We realize it's been a very long day for everyone, but we want to thank you for these rich conversations. Let me just offer a very brief conclusion, mostly about logistics. First, I want to just thank everyone again for joining us for the session today, both here on Zoom and via YouTube. We also really appreciate you all sharing your thoughts in the Q&A box. We got way more questions than we could have handled, but these are all going to be really helpful as we continue to have these conversations. Thank you to the presenters. I know you all worked very hard in preparation for today, and for many of you, this is early in the morning or very late at night. And a special thanks to our 3 moderators today. I want to remind you all that we will be posting materials from the day's sessions on our YouTube channel, so please head there at the conclusion of this 2-day symposium to see recordings from all of today's sessions and tomorrow's as well. Please join us tomorrow. Also on Zoom, you can use the same link, and we also will be live streaming to YouTube again as well. So just want to say thank you all once again, and stay healthy and stay safe, and hopefully we'll